Chapter 1. A corset-maker's son, early life in England, 1737 to 1759. The year is 1737. England is a land of deep contrasts, of powdered wigs and muddy lanes, of grand parliamentary debate and quiet, grinding poverty. In the county of Norfolk, far from the gilded corridors of London, there is a small market town called Thetford. It sits along the gentle curve of the Little Ouse River, its streets lined with timber-framed houses, its mornings filled with the smell of bread and earth and wood smoke curling up into a gray English sky. It is not a place where history expects to be made. And yet, on the 29th of January in this unremarkable town, in a modest home on a narrow street, a child is born who will one day shake the foundations of empires. His name is Thomas Paine. He enters the world as the son of Joseph Paine. The family has not yet added the that will later distinguish the man, a quiet, steady craftsman who works with his hands, bending and stitching whalebone into the corsets worn by the ladies of polite society. It is patient, precise work, and Joseph is patient, precise man. He is a Quaker, which in the England of 1737 means something important. It means he believes that every human soul carries within it a divine light, that no king, no bishop, no lord of the land holds authority over a man's conscience. He does not raise his voice in church. He does not kneel before elaborate ceremony. He sits in silence and listens to something deeper. This faith, quiet as it is, will plant seeds in his son that no institution will ever fully uproot. Thomas's mother, Frances, is a different spirit altogether. She is the daughter of an attorney, a woman of the Anglican Church, and by most accounts, a sharp and somewhat severe presence in the household. The marriage between Joseph and Frances is, in its way, a marriage of contrasts, the gentle dissenter and the proper churchwoman, and young Thomas grows up caught between their two worlds. He absorbs both, belongs fully to neither, and from this early tension, something restless begins to take shape inside him. Thetford itself is a small world, but a world nonetheless. Thomas walks its streets as a boy, past the ancient grammar school, past the market cross where traders haggle over grain and wool, past the Bell Inn where travelers from Norwich and London stop to rest their horses. The town has a history stretching back to the Saxons, and there is something in the air of a place so old, a sense, perhaps, that time does not move as quickly here as it does elsewhere, that the weight of centuries presses down on ordinary lives and keeps them in their appointed place. Thomas attends the Thetford Grammar School, where he receives what might generously be called a modest education. Latin, that language of scholars and the Church, is considered essential for any serious intellectual life in this era, and Thomas does not learn it. He will later say this himself, with something between pride and defiance, noting that he was never burdened with the weight of classical learning that so many educated men hid behind. What he does receive, however, is a gift more practical and in some ways more powerful. He learns to read English with clarity, and he discovers early that ideas, when expressed in plain and forceful language, can move people in ways that no amount of Latin oratory ever could. His father teaches him the corset trade. And so, while other boys of greater fortune are bound for Oxford or Cambridge, Thomas Paine at the age of 13 takes his place beside Joseph at the workbench. He learns to cut the whalebone, to sew the stiffened panels, to shape the garment that will hold a woman's body to the fashionable silhouette of the age. It is close, detailed work that requires patience, a certain feel for material and tension for the way things are held in place. There is, perhaps, an irony in this, that the boy who will one day write the words that loosen the corsets of political tyranny first learns his trade making the very instruments of physical constraint. But Thomas is restless. He has always been restless. There is something in him that strains against the smallness of Thetford, against the predetermined arc of a craftsman's life. He is a reader when he can find books. He is a listener in the taverns and on the streets, catching fragments of conversation about the wider world, about wars being fought, about the strange new ideas filtering in from France, about the philosophers who were beginning to ask dangerous questions about the nature of authority and the rights of men. These fragments catch in him like sparks in dry tinder. At 17, Thomas does something that speaks directly to this restlessness. He attempts to run away to sea. The vessel he sets his sights on is called the Terrible, a name belonging to a privateer ship, one of those swift, armed vessels commissioned to prey on enemy merchant ships during wartime. It is a life of danger and adventure and uncertain fortune, and it calls to something in the young Thomas that the corset workshop simply cannot satisfy. His father intercepts him before he can sail. Joseph Paine, gentle man that he is, goes to the docks and brings his son home. It is a small intervention, but history will turn on it entirely. Because aboard the Terrible, Thomas Paine would almost certainly have died. The ship sails without him, and the death toll from that voyage is staggering. Had Joseph not come to the docks that day, had he not placed his quiet, steady hand on his son's shoulder and led him back through the streets of Thetford, there would be no common sense, no rights of man, no Thomas Paine at all. History, that great and improbable river, bends around this single moment of a father's love. Thomas returns to the workshop. He bends back over the whalebone and the stitching. But the desire for a larger life does not leave him, it simply waits. A few years pass. Thomas is in his late teens now, a young man of some physical presence, with sharp eyes and a face that acquaintances will later describe as striking, strong features, a certain intensity in the expression that suggests a mind that is always moving, always turning things over. He is not yet the figure who will command the attention of continents. He is simply a young Englishman in a small Norfolk town, doing a craftsman's work, nursing a craftsman's ambitions and feeling day by day the walls of his given life pressing a little closer. In 1756, England enters the 7 Years' War, that vast global conflict that stretches from the forests of North America to the plains of India, drawing in every major European power in a struggle for empire and dominance. The world is convulsing with the ambitions of kings and the suffering of ordinary men, and Thomas, now 19, cannot resist any longer. This time he does go to sea. Not on a privateer as he once wished, but on a ship called the King of Prussia, another privateering vessel, sailing into the war that is remaking the world. The details of this voyage are not fully known. Thomas Paine himself writes little about it in later life, and what he does write is sparse, almost as though the sea-going adventure of his youth was something he held at a slight distance. What can be said is that he goes, and that he returns, and that the experience of being on the open ocean, of sailing beyond the green hedgerows and gentle rivers of Norfolk into something vast and indifferent and magnificent, does something to the geography of his imagination. He has seen, in the most literal sense, that the world is larger than Thetford. He returns to England. London pulls him in, as London has always pulled in those who find the provinces too quiet. He arrives in the city sometime around 1757, a young man of 20 without money or connections or any particular plan beyond the vague but powerful sense that something is waiting for him here. He finds work. He sets up briefly as a corset-maker in the city of London, specifically in the area of Hanover Street, plying the trade his father taught him, now in the largest and most chaotic city in the English-speaking world. London in 1757 is a place of astonishing energy and astonishing squalor. The streets near the Thames are choked with carts and livestock and the cries of vendors. Coffee houses line the major thoroughfares, those remarkable institutions of the age, where a man could sit for hours over a penny cup and listen to arguments about politics, religion, science, and philosophy. The great Samuel Johnson is here, shaping the English language with his dictionary. The painter William Hogarth is here, cataloging the vices and virtues of city life in his engravings. Ideas are in the air of London like weather, and Thomas Paine breathes them in. He attends lectures. He begins to frequent the kind of public discussions where natural philosophy, what we would call science, is demonstrated and debated. He listens to talks about astronomy and electricity, about the new mechanistic understanding of the universe that thinkers like Newton have bequeathed to the age. These ideas strike him with something like religious force. The universe, it turns out, operates on rational principles, discoverable, comprehensible, consistent. And if the universe is rational, Thomas begins to reason, why should human society be anything less? Why should the arrangement of kings and lords and bishops be treated as sacred and immutable when it is, at its core, simply an old habit, a set of arrangements made by men and therefore changeable by men? These are the thoughts of his 20s, still unformed, still turning in the dark. He does not yet have the words for them. But the questions are there, building quietly behind his sharp, watchful eyes. His London corset business does not prosper. Thomas Paine is, it seems, a man with a gift for ideas and a somewhat uncertain gift for commerce. He moves on. He tries his hand at teaching, offering lessons in English in the town of Sandwich in Kent. He is, by the accounts that survive, an effective teacher, clear, direct, able to explain complex things in simple language. This, too, is a craft he is unknowingly perfecting, though he does not yet know what he will one day build with it. In Sandwich he meets a young woman named Mary Lambert, the daughter of an excise officer. They are married in September of 1759. Thomas is 22 years old. It is a hopeful moment and a brief one. Mary becomes pregnant almost immediately, and within the year she and the infant both die. The details are uncertain, wrapped in the spare and heartbreaking language of parish records. Thomas Paine becomes a widower before he has fully become a husband. He grieves in whatever way men of his time and class and reticence were permitted to grieve, which is to say, largely in private, and without the comfort of any language quite adequate to the loss. He is 22 years old, newly bereaved, professionally adrift, living in a country that has never offered him much beyond the corset-maker's bench and the narrow horizon of a craftsman's life. He has no fortune, no standing, no patron, no platform. He has an education that the world considers incomplete. He has ideas that have no outlet. He has a hunger that he cannot yet name. But here, in this moment of apparent emptiness, something is being made. In the long, patient, difficult school of early hardship, in the Quaker household and the Norfolk market town, in the London coffee houses and the sea voyage and the grief of loss, Thomas Paine is being formed. Not finished, not polished, but formed in the way that iron is formed. By pressure, by heat, by the slow accumulation of experience pressing on a material that does not quite break. The world has not yet heard of him. He has not yet heard of America. The words that will rattle thrones and stir revolutions are still years away, still unwritten, still waiting in the silence of a mind that has not yet found its full voice. But the corset-maker's son from Thetford is ready to begin. Chapter 2. Excise Officer and Early Setbacks, 1760 to 1768. There is a particular kind of quiet that follows grief. Not the peaceful quiet of a Sunday morning or the still quiet of a library at dusk, but a hollow, directionless quiet, the kind that settles over a young man when the future he imagined has collapsed and no new future has yet taken its shape. Thomas Paine knows this quiet well in the early months of 1760. He is 23 years old, widowed, without a trade that sustains him, living in a country that has given him little reason to believe it intends to offer him anything more. And yet he does not collapse. He does not retreat entirely into the small, safe world of the workbench. Something in him, that same restlessness that once drove him toward the privateer's dock, that same hunger that pulled him to London's coffee houses and lecture halls, pushes him forward even when forward is unclear. He makes a decision that surprises no one more than perhaps himself. He applies to become an excise officer. To understand what this means, it helps to understand what the excise was in 18th century England. It is, in its simplest form, a system of taxation, a way for the British government to collect revenue on goods produced and consumed within the country itself. Excisemen, as they are called, are the officers charged with enforcing this system on the ground. They move through the countryside and towns, visiting brewers and distillers, tobacco dealers and salt merchants, checking quantities, examining records, ensuring that the proper duties have been paid to the crown. It is unglamorous, methodical work. It carries a certain social ambiguity. The exciseman is a government official, which lends him a degree of authority, but he is also a man who spends his days poking through other people's warehouses and barrels, which does not lend him a great deal of dignity. He is neither gentry nor common laborer. He inhabits that uncertain middle ground that 18th century England does not quite know what to do with. But for Thomas Paine, it represents something significant. It represents a step, however modest, toward a life governed by the mind rather than solely by the hands. It is a position that requires literacy, numeracy, a capacity for record-keeping and logical assessment. It offers a salary, small but regular. And perhaps most importantly, it offers a way of moving through the world, of traveling from town to town, of meeting people from different walks of life, of seeing the economic machinery of England from the inside, in all its creaking, unequal detail. He prepares for the examination. He studies. He submits his application. And in the summer of 1761, Thomas Paine is accepted as a supernumerary officer, essentially a trainee, not yet assigned his own district but gaining experience under the supervision of established officers in the Lincolnshire area. He rides out across the flat, wide landscape of that ancient county, learning the rhythms of the work. He visits farmers and merchants. He checks ledgers. He measures quantities. He learns the language of duty and assessment and official correspondence. There is something almost meditative about the work in these early days. The long rides across open countryside, the unhurried pace of an officer making his rounds, the particular silence of the English Midlands in winter. Thomas is not yet a political thinker in any formal sense. He is a young man doing a government job, learning a trade, trying to reconstruct a life that grief temporarily dismantled. But the excise work, unglamorous as it is quietly educating him. He is seeing England from the road, not the England of Parliament and Court, not the England of Johnson's literary London, but the England of working people, of small merchants and struggling tradesmen, of men who labor long and are taxed heavily and wonder, in the privacy of their own frustration, whether the arrangement is entirely just. In August of 1764, Thomas Paine receives his own posting. He is assigned to Alford in Lincolnshire, a small market town set among the gentle undulations of the Lincolnshire wolds. He is now a full officer with his own district, his own rounds, his own official responsibilities. He rides his beats as the circuit is called. He is, by all accounts, a diligent officer at first, conscientious, methodical, doing what is expected of him with reasonable competence. But the salary is poor. Extraordinarily poor, in fact. An excise officer in this period earns £50 a year, and from this he must provide his own horse, his own equipment, cover his own lodgings and food as he travels his district. When all practical expenses are deducted, what remains is barely enough to live on with any dignity. The gap between what the work demands and what the work rewards is vast and quietly demoralizing, and Thomas Paine begins, with the sharp eyes of a man who is good at arithmetic, to calculate exactly how wrong this arrangement is. He also begins to observe something else. He watches his fellow officers, men of similar education, similar capability, similar dedication, ground down by the same poverty, driven by financial desperation to shortcuts that the rules forbid. Stamping, it is called in the language of the excise, the practice of filing returns for goods that have not actually been inspected, of marking the records as complete when the physical rounds have not been made. It is a form of corner-cutting born not of laziness but of arithmetic. When the distances to be covered are too great, the time allotted too short, and the pay too meager to sustain the proper execution of the job, something has to give. And what gives, gradually, is the integrity of the records. Thomas Paine is not immune to this pressure. In August of 1765, less than a year into his posting at Alford, he is dismissed from the excise service. The charge against him is precisely this: stamping, filing returns for goods he had not inspected. It is a humiliating moment and a defining one. He does not deny what he has done. He cannot. The records speak for themselves. He is 28 years old, dismissed from his government post, once again without a reliable income, once again at the beginning of something that feels uncomfortably like nothing. He returns to what he knows. He picks up the corset-maker's tools once more, working in Norfolk for a time, and then in the small town of Sandwich, where he had once been a teacher, where he had once been briefly married. He moves through these places like a man temporarily inhabiting someone else's life, keeping his hands busy while his mind searches for the door back to something larger. And then, rather remarkably, he applies for reinstatement. This takes courage, or perhaps a very particular stubbornness that in Thomas Paine will prove to be one of his most consequential qualities. He writes to the Board of Excise in London. He acknowledges what happened. He asks for another chance. He waits. The machinery of government bureaucracy turns slowly, as it always has, and Thomas Paine waits in the background of his own story, teaching school in London for a period, keeping himself afloat, keeping the flame of his ambition carefully sheltered against the indifference of the world. In 1766 he is reinstated. He is placed on the waiting list for a new posting, which means he must wait again in that uncertain space between being officially an excise officer and actually having a district to work in. He teaches. He reads. He continues to frequent the kinds of establishments, the coffee houses and debating societies of London, where ideas are exchanged with the same energy that merchants exchange goods in the market. He listens more than he speaks. He is accumulating something, though he could not yet say precisely what. His posting comes in 1768. He is assigned to Lewes, a market town in East Sussex, tucked into the chalk downland of the South Downs, a place of some character and considerable civic pride. Lewes is not London, but it is not Thetford either. It is a town with a history of independence, a place where the memory of Simon de Montfort's great medieval battle for parliamentary representation still echoes in local identity. It is a town of tradesmen and professionals, of small merchants and country lawyers, of men who read the newspapers and argue about politics over their pipes in the warmth of the tavern. For Thomas Paine, Lewes is something he has not quite had before, a community. He lodges with a man named Samuel Olive, a tobacconist, whose shop becomes a kind of base of operations for Thomas's life in the town. Samuel is a civic-minded man, active in local affairs, and his household is a lively, sociable one. Thomas becomes part of it, genuinely, warmly part of it in a way that his previous years of drifting and starting over have not allowed. He joins the Headstrong Club, a debating society that meets at the White Hart Inn, where the men of Lewes gather weekly to argue about the questions of the day with great enthusiasm and, reportedly, considerable noise. Here, for the first time, Thomas Paine discovers what he can do in an argument. He is good at it. Startlingly good. He can listen to a position, dismantle it with logic, and reassemble the pieces into a counter-argument that is clearer and more forceful than what came before. He has a gift for cutting through the elaborate verbal architecture that educated men of the era used to disguise weak reasoning, and for stating plain truths in plain language that makes those truths feel, for the first time, properly visible. His fellow members of the Headstrong Club notice. They nickname him, with affection and perhaps a little awe, the ingenious exciseman. He is, in Lewes, finally something like happy. He has work that gives him structure, a community that gives him stimulation, and for the first time since the death of Mary Lambert, the prospect of a personal life. Samuel Olive dies in 1769, and Thomas, who has by now become genuinely close to the family, continues to lodge with Samuel's widow and helps to manage the tobacco shop. In March of 1771 he marries Samuel's daughter, Elizabeth Olive. She is a quiet young woman of some education, and the marriage, while not passionate in any dramatic sense, is companionable. Thomas has a home. He has a wife. He has a position in the community. He has, by the standards of his class and time, made a reasonable life. But the excise work is still grinding. The poverty is still real. The gap between what is expected of these officers and what they are paid to deliver it remains as wide and as infuriating as it ever was. And Thomas Paine, who has now spent years riding the beats of his district, watching good men compromised by impossible arithmetic, begins to do something that will change the course of his life. He begins to write about it. He drafts a document. It is called, in his careful plain hand, The Case of the Officers of Excise, a petition on behalf of his fellow officers, arguing with calm and methodical force for an increase in their pay. It is not revolutionary literature, not yet. It is a practical document, written in the plain style that will become his hallmark, laying out the economic realities of excise work with the precision of a man who has lived every one of those realities on the road. He argues that low pay does not save the government money, it costs the government money in compromised inspections, in officers forced to take other employment on the side, in the steady erosion of public trust in the revenue system itself. The logic is impeccable. The language is clear. The argument builds steadily, brick by carefully laid brick, to an unavoidable conclusion. He has 400 copies printed at considerable personal expense. He travels to London in the winter of 1772 and 1773, distributing copies to members of Parliament, to influential figures, to anyone who might have the power to act on what the document describes. He meets, during these visits, a man who runs a shop on Craven Street near the Thames, a man who is, at this point in his life, perhaps the most famous American in London, a scientist and diplomat of extraordinary reputation, a man whose experiments with lightning and electricity have made him a celebrity on 2 continents. His name is Benjamin Franklin. The meeting between Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin is not, in most historical accounts, a lengthy or deeply intimate one. Franklin is a busy man, a celebrated man, a man with the concerns of an entire colonial dispute on his shoulders. But he reads the excise petition. He is impressed by it. He sees in Thomas Paine something that he recognizes, the quality of mind that cuts through, that simplifies without losing truth, that speaks to people rather than past them. He gives Paine a letter of introduction. He suggests, perhaps in passing, perhaps with more intention than it appears, that a man of Thomas Paine's abilities might find greater opportunity in America than in England. America. The word enters Thomas Paine's life quietly, without fanfare, as a suggestion rather than a summons. He turns it over in his mind and files it away. He still has his petition to attend to. He still has his life in Lewis, his wife, his posting, his rounds. But the excise campaign fails. The petition circulates. It is read. It is noted. And then, with the crushing indifference of an institution confronting inconvenient arithmetic, the government does nothing. No raise is forthcoming. The officers remain as underpaid as before. And Thomas Paine, who has spent his own money, his own time, his own energy making the case with perfect clarity, is left with nothing to show for it but the knowledge that he was right and the bitter, familiar understanding that being right in England is rarely enough. Worse follows. In April of 1774 he is dismissed from the excise service for a second time, ostensibly for absences from his post during the periods when he was in London distributing the petition, though the financial difficulties of the olive tobacco shop, in which he has become entangled, may also play a role. The shop is failing. The household finances are in disarray. And then, in June of 1774, in a development that is recorded in the spare legal language of the period with no elaboration, Thomas and Elizabeth Paine formally separate. The marriage ends as quietly as it began. No divorce is granted. Divorce in this era is a proceeding for the wealthy and the extraordinary, but they agree to part, and Thomas Paine is once again alone. He is 37 years old. He has been dismissed from his government post twice. He has failed as a corset-maker. He has failed as a shopkeeper. He has seen his petition come to nothing. He has lost a wife to death and another to separation. He is in debt. He is without income. He is without prospects. By any reasonable measure, Thomas Paine is a man at the end of something. But Benjamin Franklin's letter is still in his pocket. And America, that distant, turbulent, possibility-haunted place across the Atlantic, is still out there, waiting as it seemed to wait for so many of the broken and the restless and the dangerously talented, with something that England has never quite managed to offer Thomas Paine. A chance. Chapter 3. Civic Leader, Second Marriage, and Final Dismissal, 1768 to 1774. There is a particular quality to the light in Lewis in the early autumn. It falls at an angle across the chalk downland, soft and golden, catching the flint in the old stone walls and making even the most ordinary street corner look as though it has been carefully painted by someone who understood the value of stillness. The town sits in a natural bowl carved by the river Ouse, the South Downs rising around it on all sides like the walls of an amphitheater, and there is a feeling in Lewis, a feeling that the town itself seems to cultivate, of being enclosed, protected, apart from the wider turbulence of the world. It is a feeling that suits certain people very well. For Thomas Paine, it is both a comfort and a provocation. He arrives here in 1768, 31 years old, newly reinstated to the excise service after the humiliation of his dismissal, carrying with him the accumulated weight of a decade of false starts and narrow escapes and quiet disappointments. He has been a corset-maker and a sailor and a teacher and a failed exciseman and a teacher again. He has been a husband and a widower. He has moved through the towns and cities of England like a man searching for the right room in a house whose layout he cannot quite memorize. And now he is here in Lewes, riding his excise beats across the surrounding countryside, checking the books of local brewers and traders, doing the methodical, underpaid work of a government officer in a place that, against all expectation, begins to feel like somewhere he might actually belong. He lodges, as we have noted, with Samuel Olive on the High Street. The Olive household is a warm one, the kind of household that gathers people naturally, that makes room at the table without making a ceremony of it. Samuel is a man of civic conscience and quiet humor, a tobacconist who takes his role in the life of the town seriously, who knows his neighbors by name and his neighbors' troubles by long familiarity. His wife is capable and kind. His daughter Elizabeth is young, younger than Thomas by a meaningful margin, and observant in the way of young women who have grown up in a house full of conversation. She listens carefully, says less than she thinks, and notices more than most people around her realize. Thomas settles into this household as naturally as he has settled into anything in his adult life. He pays his lodging. He rides his rounds. He comes home in the evenings to the warmth of the Olive parlor, and gradually, week by week, the edges of his solitude begin to soften. He is not yet the public figure he will become. He is simply a lodger, a young government officer of modest means and considerable opinions, a man who reads more than his neighbors and argues more articulately than almost any of them. But there is something about Lewes that draws this quality out of him, that provides for the first time a stage properly sized for the talents he has been carrying around with nowhere to put them. The stage is the White Hart Inn, and the performance is the Headstrong Club. The White Hart is one of those establishments that serves as the living room of a town's intellectual life, a place where the professional and the tradesman and the civic-minded gather not merely to drink but to think, or at least to argue, which in the 18th century amounts to much the same thing. The Headstrong Club meets here regularly, and its membership is drawn from the kind of Lewes men who take seriously the idea that the affairs of the nation are the proper concern of ordinary citizens. Not just the aristocracy, not just the members of Parliament, but the merchants and the lawyers and the excisemen who actually live within the consequences of policy and law. The debates range widely. The great questions of the day, the taxation of the American colonies, the conduct of the war with France, the treatment of dissenters, the reach of parliamentary authority, all find their way to the table at the White Hart, where they are seized upon, turned over, argued from every angle, and generally subjected to the kind of vigorous informal examination that the formal institutions of the nation are far too dignified to permit. It is loud. It is occasionally heated. It is, for Thomas Paine, something very close to paradise. He discovers here what he has only dimly suspected about himself, that he is not merely a man with opinions, but a man with a gift for the architecture of argument. Where others state positions, Thomas builds cases. Where others assert, he demonstrates. He has the exciseman's instinct for following a chain of reasoning to its logical conclusion, for not looking away from the number at the bottom of the column just because it is inconvenient, and he applies this instinct to political and moral questions with a directness that his fellow members find variously exhilarating and discomforting, depending on which side of the argument they happen to occupy. The nickname comes easily, the ingenious exciseman. It is said with warmth, and Thomas wears it with something between modesty and satisfaction. He has earned it honestly in the currency of the debating room, by being sharper, clearer, and more persistently logical than the men around him, most of whom have had considerably more formal education than he has. This last fact is not lost on him. There is, in Thomas Paine's intellectual manner at Lewes, a certain quiet defiance. The defiance of a man who was denied the classical education that his era considers the prerequisite for serious thought, and who has decided, without making a great show of it, to think seriously anyway. He writes too. Not yet for publication, not yet in the voice that will carry across oceans, but for the entertainment and edification of his fellow club members. He composes satirical verses, occasional pieces, small exercises in political humor that circulate among the headstrong club's membership with considerable approval. These pieces are not preserved in any comprehensive way, they belong to the ephemeral life of a local debating society rather than to the historical record. But their existence tells us something important. Thomas Paine is practicing. He is learning, in the forgiving atmosphere of an audience that knows him and wishes him well, the craft of shaping thought into language that moves and persuades and occasionally makes people laugh at precisely the right moment. The town of Lewes itself continues to educate him in ways that no formal institution has. He walks its streets, up the high street past the castle, down toward the river, through the market where the farmers bring their produce from the surrounding downs, and he absorbs the texture of civic life as it is actually lived. He sees the local magistrates at work and at leisure. He watches the way that wealth and poverty operate in close proximity to one another in a market town, how the prosperous draper lives 3 streets from the laborer who can barely feed his children, and how the laws and customs that govern both of them are written almost entirely by and for the interests of the former. He is not yet theorizing about this. He is simply seeing it, filing it away in the precise, retentive memory of a man who was trained by necessity to notice what others overlook. He becomes involved in parish affairs, the practical, unglamorous business of local governance that occupies so much of the energy of English civic life in this period. Church rates, road maintenance, the relief of the poor, these are not romantic subjects, but they are consequential ones, and Thomas Paine engages with them seriously, serving on local committees, attending vestry meetings, learning the machinery of community decision-making from the inside. It is another form of education, this one entirely practical. A lesson in how power actually functions at its most granular level, how decisions that affect ordinary lives are made by small groups of men in small rooms, how the gap between official procedure and actual outcome is almost always wider than the rules suggest it should be. Then in 1769, Samuel Olive dies. It is not a dramatic death, not a sudden crisis or a public tragedy, but the quiet passing of a good man of middling years, leaving behind a widow, a daughter, and a tobacco shop that requires someone to run it. Thomas Paine, who has by this point become genuinely woven into the fabric of the Olive household, does not step back. He stays. He helps Mrs. Olive manage the shop. He continues in his role as lodger, but the relationship has deepened now into something closer to family, the kind of closeness that grief sometimes creates between people who might otherwise have remained at a comfortable, sociable distance. Elizabeth Olive is 20 years old when her father dies. She is, by the accounts that survive, a sensible and capable young woman, not given to dramatic displays of feeling, but steady in the way that people who have grown up in trade tend to be steady, accustomed to the practical demands of running a household and a business without the luxury of extended contemplation. She and Thomas have known each other for a year now. They have shared meals and evenings and the particular intimacy of a small household in which everyone is aware of everyone else's moods and habits and small peculiarities. Something has grown between them that is not quite passion. Thomas Paine, at 32, is not a man in whom passion of the romantic variety seems to occupy much space, but something quieter and perhaps more durable. Mutual regard, shared intelligence, the comfort of understanding. They marry on the 10th of March, 1771, in the parish church of St. Michael in Lewes. It is a modest ceremony in keeping with the modest circumstances of both parties. Thomas is 34. Elizabeth is 21. They set up together in the Olive House, and Thomas takes on a more formal role in the management of the tobacco shop alongside his excise duties. He is, for the first time in his adult life, something that resembles settled. He has a wife, a home, a business, a position, a community. He has the Headstrong Club and the White Hart Inn and the chalk hills of the South Downs visible from the upper windows of the house on the High Street. It is not a grand life. But it is a life, coherent and connected in ways that his previous years conspicuously were not. And within it, Thomas Paine continues to develop, continues to read, to argue, to observe, to write in his spare manner, laying down the intellectual foundations of something whose full dimensions he cannot yet see. The years from 1771 to 1773 are, in outward terms, the most conventionally successful of Thomas Paine's English life. He is respected in the town. His opinions carry weight at the headstrong club. He is known as a fair and thorough excise officer, a reliable participant in local affairs, a man whose company is valued by people of several different social stations. Even his writing, such as it is in this period, has begun to attract a modest attention beyond the immediate circle of the club. But beneath this surface of modest respectability, the ground is shifting. The excise work is still always the central problem. The salary has not improved. The distances to be covered have not shortened. The official expectations have not diminished to match the official pay. Thomas rides his rounds with the same diligence he has always brought to the work, but the arithmetic of the thing, the cold, unanswerable arithmetic of what the job costs against what it pays, presses on him daily with a weight that no amount of civic engagement or domestic contentment can fully offset. He watches his fellow officers, men of comparable ability and dedication, struggling with the same impossible equation. He sees the damage it does, not just to their finances but to their dignity, their sense of purpose, their faith in the institution they serve. And so he begins to write about it. The case of the officers of excise takes shape gradually, in the evenings after the accounts are done and the household is quiet, in the careful, unhurried manner of a man who has learned to take his time with the things that matter. It is not a passionate document in the way that his later writing will be passionate. It does not reach for the grand and resonant phrases that will one day move continents. It is instead a methodical, patient, thoroughly reasoned argument, built on evidence and logic, making the case for better pay with the precision of a man who has spent years doing the exact calculations the document describes. He argues that £50 a year is not merely inadequate, it is structurally inadequate in a way that the system itself has designed and refuses to acknowledge. He lays out the real costs of the work, the horse, the equipment, the lodgings, the food, the incidental expenses of a man who must be constantly mobile across a wide district. He shows, line by careful line, that after these costs are met, what remains is not a living wage but a slow financial erosion that forces officers into exactly the compromises that the service then punishes them for making. The argument is, in its quiet way, devastating. It does not accuse. It does not moralize. It simply demonstrates, with the patient clarity of a man who has nothing to hide and everything to lose, that the system is broken in ways that can be precisely measured. He has 400 copies printed, spending money he cannot easily spare. He goes to London twice in the winters of 1772 and 1773, distributing the pamphlet to anyone in a position of influence who might be persuaded to act upon it. He is not a natural lobbyist. He does not have the easy social confidence of a man born to drawrooms, does not move with the fluency through the corridors of power that those who have always had access to them tend to acquire without noticing. But he is persistent. He is clear. He can make his case in person with the same directness he brings to the page, and there are people in London who listen to him, who nod, who agree that the situation of the excise officers is genuinely unjust and genuinely in need of remedy. Benjamin Franklin listens. Thomas meets him during these London visits, meets him in the bookshop on Craven Street that Franklin runs with the easy, curious energy of a man who finds everything interesting and has the intellectual capacity to do something useful with that interest. Franklin reads the excise pamphlet. He is 66 years old, one of the most celebrated minds in the Atlantic world, a man who has corresponded with Voltaire and debated with kings, and he reads Thomas Paine's careful, plain, methodical argument and sees in it the signature of a mind that works in ways he recognizes and respects. The thinking is honest. The language is clear. The logic is sound. These are not qualities that Franklin takes for granted. Their conversations range beyond the excise question. Franklin is in London as the agent of the Pennsylvania Assembly, navigating the increasingly dangerous waters of colonial politics. The dispute over taxation, the growing fury in America at parliamentary overreach, the sense on both sides of the Atlantic that something is approaching that cannot be indefinitely managed. He speaks to Thomas about America with the particular combination of pride and anxiety that characterizes his relationship with the colonies he loves and the empire he increasingly cannot stomach. He suggests, with the careful indirection of a diplomat, that a man of Thomas Paine's intelligence and communicative gifts might find in America a more receptive audience than England has shown any inclination to provide. Thomas listens. He files the suggestion carefully away. He has a life in Lewis still, a wife and a home and a campaign that is not yet concluded, and he is not yet ready to contemplate something as large and uncertain as an ocean crossing. But the idea has been placed, and it will not leave him entirely alone. The campaign fails. The petition circulates through the appropriate channels. It is noted, discussed in the limited way that bureaucratic institutions discuss proposals that would cost them something, and then quietly set aside. No increase in pay is forthcoming. The Board of Excise thanks no one and changes nothing. Thomas Paine has spent his own money, his own time, his own considerable mental energy producing a document of impeccable logic and practical clarity, and the government of England has responded with the infuriating serenity of an institution that knows it does not have to listen. The personal consequences arrive in rapid succession, and they are severe. In April of 1774, Thomas is dismissed from the excise service for the second time. The official reason given is his absence from his post during the periods he spent in London distributing the petition, a charge that is technically accurate and deeply unfair in the way that institutional punishments often are, hitting the form while deliberately missing the substance of what has occurred. He is, in other words, dismissed for caring enough about the injustice of his situation to do something about it. The irony is not lost on him. It will not, in the years ahead, be forgotten. The tobacco shop is by this point in serious financial difficulty. The management of a small retail business is not Thomas Paine's strongest suit. He is too easily drawn to the abstractions of debate and pamphlet writing to give the shop the relentless practical attention that small commercial enterprises demand, and the combined pressure of his absences in London, the loss of his excise salary, and the general economic precariousness of the period has left the business in a state that cannot be easily rescued. There are debts. There are creditors. There is the particular humiliation of watching a household's small accumulation of objects and securities be itemized and sold to satisfy obligations that should never have grown so large. The marriage, already tested by financial strain and the long absences of the London visits, does not survive this final accumulation of pressure. In June of 1774, Thomas and Elizabeth Paine agree to separate. The terms of the separation are arranged quietly, without legal drama, divorce being an instrument too expensive and complicated for people of their station, and Elizabeth returns to her mother with the remnants of the household and the ruins of the shop, and Thomas is left with very little beyond the clothes on his back, the debts against his name, and whatever exists inside him that refuses, despite every reasonable argument in favor of giving up, to be entirely extinguished. He is 37 years old. The accounting of his English life, if made coldly, is not encouraging. 2 dismissals from the excise. 2 failed marriages in their different ways. Failed as a tradesman. Marginalized as a political advocate. In debt. Alone. And yet, somewhere in a London drawer or folded in a pocket, is Benjamin Franklin's letter of introduction, a document that names Thomas Paine as a man worth knowing, a man of uncommon intelligence and communicative gifts, a man whose talents might find better soil in a place less committed than England to the proposition that a corset-maker's son should remain in the station to which he was born. He goes to London. He goes to see Franklin. And Franklin, who has seen enough of the world to recognize the thing he is looking at when it stands in front of him, confirms what the letter already says, and helps Thomas Paine arrange passage across the Atlantic to a place called Philadelphia, in a colony called Pennsylvania, in a new world that is, at this very moment, in the early and dangerous stages of deciding that it will no longer be governed by the old one. Thomas Paine boards the ship in the autumn of 1774. He is ill during the crossing. Severely ill, in fact, weakened by fever in a way that would kill many men and very nearly kills him, and he arrives in Philadelphia in a state of physical collapse, carried from the ship on a stretcher, brought to health slowly in lodgings arranged by the kindness of strangers who have read Franklin's letter and decided, on the strength of it, to keep this particular stranger alive. England does not look up as he leaves. England rarely notices the departure of its corset-maker's sons. It has no way of knowing, in the autumn of 1774, what it is releasing into the world. No way of knowing that the man it has dismissed twice, failed twice, and finally driven to the docks is carrying inside him, in the disciplined, precise, plain-speaking, incandescently logical mind behind those sharp and watchful eyes, words that will shake it to its foundations. The ship moves out into the gray Atlantic. The English coast grows smaller and then it is gone. And Thomas Paine faces west. Chapter 4. Crossing the Atlantic, arrival in Philadelphia, 1774. The Thames in autumn has a particular smell, salt and mud and coal smoke, and the deep, brackish particular of a river that has carried the weight of a great city for 1,000 years. It is not a romantic smell. It is the smell of commerce and consequence, of things being moved from one place to another by men whose names no one will record, in ships whose passage no one will celebrate. And yet it is on this river, in the gray and unremarkable autumn of 1774, that Thomas Paine stands at the edge of the only life he has ever known and prepares to step away from it entirely. He is 37 years old. He has, by any reasonable measure, very little left to lose. The ship that will carry him across the Atlantic is not a grand vessel. It is not the kind of ship that figures in romantic literature, with billowing white sails and a captain of noble bearing standing resolute at the prow. It is a working ship, a merchant vessel of the kind that makes the Atlantic crossing routinely, carrying cargo and passengers and correspondence between the old world and the new with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of an enterprise driven by profit rather than poetry. The passengers are a mixed company, emigrants and merchants, indentured servants and minor officials, people moving toward something and people moving away from something, all of them thrown together in the close and unforgiving quarters of an 18th-century ocean crossing. Thomas boards with Franklin's letter of introduction folded carefully among his few possessions. It is, in material terms, almost the entirety of what he carries with him of value. He has no fortune, quite the opposite given the debts he leaves behind in England. He has no professional standing, having been twice dismissed from the only government position he ever held. He has no family connection to the New World, no friend waiting on the other side, no established community into which he will be received with the warmth of prior acquaintance. He has Benjamin Franklin's name on a piece of paper, the clothes on his back, and whatever it is that exists inside him, that restless, precise, incandescently logical interior life, that has survived everything England has thrown at it and emerged, battered but fundamentally unbroken, on the other side. The ship moves out of the Thames estuary and into the Channel, and England recedes behind it. The chalk cliffs of the south coast appear and then diminish and then are gone, swallowed by the gray November sea, and Thomas Paine watches them go with whatever complicated mixture of feeling accompanies the act of leaving the only country one has ever known. There is relief in it, almost certainly. The England he is leaving has not been kind to him in any systematic way, has offered him hard work and inadequate reward, has punished his ambition and ignored his arguments, has twice dismissed him from the modest security of a government post and watched with institutional indifference as his domestic life collapsed under the weight of financial impossibility. He owes England very little in the way of sentiment. And yet it is his. The rolling Norfolk countryside where he was born, the smell of the corset-maker's workshop, the particular grey light of a Thetford morning, the voices of the headstrong club raised in cheerful argument around the table at the White Hart. These things are his, made of the same material as his earliest memory and his most formed habits of thought. A man does not leave all of this without feeling, even when the leaving is unambiguously necessary, even when what he is leaving behind contains very little that he would choose to return to. The Channel gives way to the open Atlantic, and the open Atlantic is something else entirely. There is no way to adequately prepare in the 18th century for the experience of deep ocean passage. The English countryside, even at its most expansive, is a human landscape, marked and bounded and domesticated by centuries of habitation. Even the sea, as experienced from the coast or in the Channel, retains a relationship with the land that keeps it comprehensible, scaled to something the human mind can hold. But the open Atlantic in November is none of these things. It is vast in a way that the word vast cannot fully capture. An immensity of gray water stretching in every direction to a horizon that offers nothing, no landmark, no reference point, no evidence that the world contains anything other than water and sky and the small, vulnerable, creaking vessel in between. For a man of Thomas Paine's temperament, a man who has spent his adult life in the managed environments of market towns and government offices and debating societies, a man whose intellectual world is constructed from the careful, sequential logic of human reason. The Atlantic must be a profound and disorienting encounter with something that exceeds the categories he has built his thinking from. The ocean does not argue. It does not respond to petitions. It is not amenable to the kind of plain-spoken, methodical reasoning that Thomas has spent years perfecting in the debating rooms of Lewis. It simply is enormous and indifferent, and the ship moves across it at the mercy of winds that owe no allegiance to any human agenda. The crossing takes weeks. The exact duration varies with the winds and the weather in the North Atlantic in the late autumn of 1774 is not, by any account, forgiving. The ship pitches and rolls in the kind of November swells that test the sea legs of experienced sailors, let alone the endurance of passengers who are spending most of their days below decks in the cramped, ill-ventilated quarters of an emigrant vessel. The food is monotonous and of diminishing quality as the voyage extends. Fresh water is strictly rationed. The smell below decks, of unwashed bodies and bilge water and the particular sourness of confined humanity, is something that no amount of subsequent experience entirely erases from the memory of those who have endured it. And then Thomas Paine becomes ill. It is not the mild discomfort of seasickness, though that may be part of it. What strikes him somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic crossing is something more serious. A fever, virulent and debilitating, of the kind that the 18th century cannot diagnose with precision and can treat only with the rough, pragmatic interventions available in the medical kit of a merchant vessel's captain. He burns with it. He shakes with it. He lies in his bunk in the ship's quarters while the Atlantic heaves around him and the fever works through him with the systematic thoroughness of something that does not yet know it will fail to kill him. This is not a metaphor. This is a man in genuine mortal danger in the middle of an ocean, weeks from the nearest shore in either direction, with no doctor and no hospital and no recourse beyond whatever strength his own body can muster and whatever care his fellow passengers are willing and able to provide. He is, by all accounts, seriously enough ill that his survival is not at any point during the crossing a certainty. The fever is one of those crossing point moments that history tends to pass over quickly. A brief mention in the biographical record, a sentence about illness, before moving on to the more consequential events that follow. But it is worth dwelling on, if only for a moment, because it is another of those points at which the thread of Thomas Paine's life runs very close to simply ending, and everything that depends on his survival, common sense, the rights of man, the American Revolution itself, in some measure, depends on the fever breaking rather than the man. The fever breaks. Slowly, then with more conviction, Thomas Paine's body reasserts itself against whatever has invaded it, and the illness retreats, leaving him weakened and thin and exhausted, but alive. He emerges from the worst of it somewhere in the latter part of the crossing, lying in his bunk and watching the faint gray light that comes through the gaps in the ship's planking and listening to the creak of the rigging above, and whatever he thinks in this particular moment, weakened, recovered, crossing the ocean toward a life he cannot yet imagine, is not recorded. He is not yet the kind of man whose inner life is documented. He will become that man. But not yet. The coast of America appears. It appears, to those on the ship who first see it, as a low dark line on the western horizon, barely distinguishable at first from the ocean itself, requiring a certain squinting confidence to identify as land rather than cloud or shadow or the eye's own wishful projection. And then it clarifies and solidifies and grows, and the line becomes a shore, and the shore becomes a landscape, and the landscape becomes the Delaware River, wide and gray-brown and magnificent, carrying the ship on its broad current toward the city that sits at the junction of the Delaware and the Schuylkill, the city that is, in the autumn of 1774, one of the most extraordinary places in the English-speaking world. Philadelphia. To arrive in Philadelphia in November of 1774 is to arrive at the precise center of something enormous. The city is the largest in British North America. Larger than Boston, larger than New York, a place of nearly 40,000 souls, of wide, grid-planned streets and red brick buildings and a civic energy that visitors from Europe consistently describe with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. It has been laid out with the rational optimism of its founder, William Penn, who envisioned a city of order and tolerance, streets running at right angles, open squares providing light and air, a place where people of different faiths and origins might live alongside one another without the religious persecution that had driven so many of them from the Old World in the first place. The vision has not been perfectly realized. No urban vision ever is, but enough of it has survived and flourished to give Philadelphia a character unlike any city Thomas Paine has previously encountered. It is also, in November of 1774, a city vibrating with political tension of a kind that makes the debates of the headstrong club seem, in retrospect, like a gentlemanly rehearsal for something far more consequential. The First Continental Congress has just concluded its sessions here. That remarkable gathering of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, convened in September to coordinate the colonial response to the intolerable acts. The package of parliamentary legislation passed in the wake of the Boston Tea Party with the explicit intention of punishing Massachusetts and reasserting British authority over its increasingly restive American subjects. The delegates have gone home, but the conversations they began have not ended. They have spilled out into the taverns and coffee houses and print shops of the city, into the pamphlets and newspapers that circulate through the streets with the urgent energy of a community that understands, dimly but increasingly certainly, that it is living through something that will not be easily or peacefully resolved. Thomas Paine arrives into all of this carried from the ship on a stretcher. He is too ill to walk. The fever that gripped him on the crossing has left him physically depleted in ways that make independent movement, at least initially, impossible. He is helped ashore by sailors and fellow passengers, brought to lodgings arranged through the network of contacts that Franklin's letter sets in motion. The letter is presented. The name Benjamin Franklin opens doors in Philadelphia as it opens doors in London, not in the same way, not through the same social mechanisms, but with the same fundamental effect. People look at it, look at the man who carries it, and decide to make room. The man who does most to make room is Dr. John Kearsley, Jr., a Philadelphia physician who reads Franklin's letter and takes a sufficient interest in its bearer to arrange proper lodgings and medical attention. Thomas is installed somewhere comfortable. The precise address is not firmly established in the historical record, and a doctor attends him, and for several weeks he does very little beyond recovering. He sleeps. He is fed. He begins, slowly, to regain the physical strength that the crossing stripped from him. And as he recovers, lying in his Philadelphia lodgings, listening to the sounds of the city outside his window, the cart wheels on the cobblestones, the voices of street vendors, the distant bell of Christ Church marking the hours, he begins to absorb, in the particular way that Thomas Paine absorbs things, the nature of the place he has arrived in. It is a city of newspapers. This is, for Thomas Paine, a fact of considerable importance. London has its newspapers, of course, but Philadelphia in 1774 has a print culture of exceptional vitality, a network of newspapers and pamphlets and broadsides that circulate political argument through the population with a speed and reach that the relatively restricted literacy of English market towns cannot match. The Pennsylvania Gazette, the Pennsylvania Journal, the Pennsylvania Packet. These publications reach into every coffee house and tavern and parlor in the city, and through the city's commercial networks into the surrounding countryside, carrying the arguments of colonial politics to an audience that is, by the standards of the era, remarkably broad and remarkably engaged. Thomas reads everything he can get his hands on. As his health returns, he begins to move through the city, carefully at first, still weak, but with increasing energy and confidence as the weeks pass. He walks the straight streets of Penn's Grid, observing the city with the same careful, retentive attention he brought to the streets of Lewes and London, but now directed at a society that is genuinely unlike anything he has previously encountered. Philadelphia is not England. This seems obvious enough stated plainly, but the reality of it, the lived, experienced, street-level reality of the difference, strikes Thomas with a force that is difficult to overstate. The social architecture of England, that elaborate, invisible, entirely pervasive structure of class and deference and inherited station that shapes every interaction, every possibility, every horizon of expectation, is present in Philadelphia, but in a profoundly attenuated form. There are wealthy men here certainly. There are the great merchant families, the lawyers and landowners and professional men who constitute something like a colonial upper class. But the distance between the top and the bottom of Philadelphia's social hierarchy is nothing like the vertiginous chasm that separates an English lord from an English laborer. A tradesman in Philadelphia can look a merchant in the eye. A man without family connection or inherited wealth can, if he has talent and determination, find his way into rooms that his English equivalent would never be permitted to enter. For a corset-maker's son from Thetford who has spent 37 years being told, in the various indirect but unmistakable ways that English society communicates these things, that his ambitions exceed his station, this is not a minor observation. It is a revelation. It is the first tangible evidence that the world is not necessarily organized in the way that England has always insisted it must be organized, that the arrangement of things is not natural law but human choice, and that choices can be made differently. He meets people. Franklin's letter continues to do its work, introducing him into the network of Philadelphia's intellectual and professional life with a momentum that his own social skills, considerable but untested in this new environment, gradually take over and sustain. He meets Robert Aitken, a Scottish-born printer who has recently established a new publication called the Pennsylvania Magazine, or American Monthly Museum. Aitken is looking for an editor, someone who can bring order and quality to the publication, who can write with authority on a range of subjects, who understands the mechanics of print culture and the demands of a reading public that is hungry for material that engages seriously with the moment it is living through. He looks at Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine looks at him. And something passes between them that is recognizable, even across the distance of 2.5 centuries, as the particular electric moment of two people discovering that they need each other. Thomas Paine becomes the editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine in January of 1775. He is 37 years old, newly arrived in a city he barely knows, still regaining his physical strength after the illness of the crossing, still learning the particular rhythms and references of colonial American political culture. And yet he takes to the work with an immediate confidence that suggests he has been preparing for it, unknowingly, through every excise beat and debating society evening and failed petition and long night of private reading, for his entire adult life. He writes. He edits. He commissions. He shapes the magazine into a publication of genuine substance and growing reputation, attracting subscribers and contributors with the energy of a man who has finally found the instrument his abilities have been waiting for. His own contributions range widely, from essays on natural philosophy to observations on social custom, from reflections on commerce to increasingly pointed commentary on the political situation developing around him. He writes about the treatment of women. He writes about the institution of slavery, which he finds, with the directness that will always characterize his engagement with moral questions, an abomination that no civilized society can rationally defend. He is, in these early Philadelphia writings, not yet the revolutionary pamphleteer who will change history. But the voice is forming. The instrument is being tuned. And the city around him is accelerating towards something. The streets of Philadelphia in the early months of 1775 carry a tension that Thomas Paine, newly arrived but acutely perceptive, can feel as clearly as he can feel the January cold coming off the Delaware. The reports from Massachusetts are frightening and galvanizing in equal measure. The British military buildup in Boston, the increasingly confrontational encounters between colonial militia and British regulars, the sense spreading through every colony that the dispute has moved beyond the point where words and petitions and legal arguments can resolve it. The Continental Congress will convene again in May. Men are drilling in the town squares of Pennsylvania. Pamphlets are being written and printed and read and argued over with a ferocity that would have seemed excessive even in the most heated sessions of the Headstrong Club. Thomas Paine sits at his editor's desk in Philadelphia and reads all of it, and thinks about all of it, with the precise, unsparing, methodical intelligence of a man who has spent his entire life noticing what others prefer not to see and saying plainly what others are not quite willing to say. He thinks about kings and about the arrangements that kings require, and about whether those arrangements are, in the plain, logical, unanswerable sense that he has always applied to such questions, actually defensible. He thinks about the colonies and their grievances and whether those grievances constitute merely a commercial dispute or something larger, something more fundamental, something that goes to the very heart of what it means for one group of people to govern another without their consent. He is not yet ready to write what these thoughts are building toward. The ideas are still organizing themselves, still finding their proper sequence, still testing their own logic against the resistance of his own demanding critical intelligence. He will be ready soon. The situation developing around him will not wait much longer for anyone's readiness. But for now, Thomas Paine walks the streets of Philadelphia in the early weeks of 1775, still thin from his illness, still learning the city, still finding his footing in a world that is entirely new to him, and watches and listens and thinks. The fever that nearly killed him on the Atlantic is fully gone. The England that dismissed him twice and offered him nothing in the end has receded to a memory and a lesson. Ahead of him, though he cannot yet see its full shape, is the work that will define not just his own life but the lives of millions of people who will never know his name. The corset-maker's son has crossed the ocean. He has survived the crossing. He is here, in the city where the future is being argued into existence, with a pen in his hand and a mind that is ready at last to use it. The world is about to hear from Thomas Paine. Chapter 5. Pennsylvania Magazine and the Seeds of Revolution, 1775. There is a particular kind of morning that Philadelphia produces in the early weeks of January, cold and clear and full of a light that comes off the Delaware River with a sharpness that has nothing of the soft gray diffusion of English winter light. It is a light that seems to demand attention, that makes the red brick of the city's buildings glow with a warmth that the temperature entirely contradicts, that catches the frost on the cobblestones and turns the ordinary street into something almost ceremonial. Thomas Paine, still thin from his Atlantic illness, still finding the rhythms of a city that is entirely unlike any he has previously inhabited, walks through this light in the opening days of 1775 and feels, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, that the place he is standing in and the moment he is standing in are genuinely, precisely suited to what he is. He has work. Real work, not the grinding, underpaid circuit riding of the excise officer, not the hopeless financial management of a failing tobacco shop, but the work of the mind, the work of the page, the work that he has been, without fully knowing it, preparing himself for across the entire difficult, circuitous, improbable arc of his English years. He is the editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine or American Monthly Museum, and the responsibility of that position, the daily, practical, exhilarating responsibility of shaping a publication that aspires to engage seriously with the most serious moment in the history of British North America, fits him the way that almost nothing in his previous life has fit him. Naturally, completely, without the constant friction of a man performing a role that was designed for someone else. Robert Aitken's print shop is on Front Street, close to the waterfront, in the part of Philadelphia that smells of river water and ink and the particular productive industry of a commercial city that takes its commerce seriously. The press itself is a magnificent thing to Thomas. Those heavy, precise, mechanical implements of democratic possibility, the type set by hand, letter by careful letter, the paper fed through with a rhythm that is almost musical, the printed page emerging with its cargo of thought made permanent and reproducible and transmissible across distances that no single human voice could ever reach. He has always been drawn to the idea of print, to the democratizing power of the written word made available beyond the circles of the privileged. And here, with his hands on the actual machinery of it, the idea becomes something more than philosophical attraction. It becomes vocation. The Pennsylvania Magazine has been in existence for only a month when Thomas takes it over, and in that brief period it has established itself as a publication of decent but unremarkable quality, the kind of general interest magazine that the colonial reading public of 1775 can find several versions of, not yet distinguished by any particular editorial vision or compelling reason to prefer it over its competitors. Thomas sets about changing this with the focused energy of a man who has waited too long for an outlet and intends to make the most of it now that one has arrived. He writes. He writes with a fluency and a range that surprises even those who have read Franklin's letter and formed expectations accordingly. In the first months of his editorship, his contributions to the Pennsylvania Magazine span an extraordinary breadth of subject matter. Natural philosophy and social observation, moral argument and cultural commentary, practical science and political reflection. He writes about the transit of planets. He writes about the design of a new iron bridge he has conceived in his restless, engineering-minded imagination. He writes about the commerce of nations and the nature of justice and the particular hypocrisy of a civilization that congratulates itself on its liberty while maintaining the institution of slavery with the systematic brutality of people who have decided not to look at what they are doing. This last subject, slavery, produces one of his earliest and most significant American essays. It appears in the Pennsylvania Magazine in March of 1775, under the title African Slavery in America, and it is, for its moment, a document of remarkable directness and moral courage. Thomas does not approach the subject with the tentative qualifications that most writers of his era bring to it, hedging their moral objections with economic observations and cultural relativisms designed to soften a conclusion that everyone knows is coming but no one quite wants to state plainly. Thomas states it plainly. He argues that slavery is not merely unfortunate or economically questionable or socially awkward. It is wrong, comprehensively and indefensibly wrong, a practice that contradicts every principle of natural justice and human dignity that the colonial leadership is simultaneously invoking in its arguments against British tyranny. The contradiction, he points out with the logical precision that is becoming his signature, is not a small one. It is not a peripheral inconsistency that can be quietly set aside. It is a fundamental rupture at the heart of the colonial cause, a rupture that, if not addressed, will hollow out the very principles in whose name the cause is being prosecuted. The essay makes an impression. It circulates beyond the magazine itself, discussed in coffee houses and drawing rooms and print shops with the particular energy that attaches to an argument that says clearly what many people have been thinking but have lacked either the courage or the language to express. Thomas Paine is not yet famous. But he is beginning, in the specific, intimate way that ideas travel through a city's intellectual networks, to be known. People are beginning to associate his name with a quality of thought, a plainness, a directness, an unsparing logical honesty, that stands out against the more ornate and hedged discourse of the era. He also writes, in these early months, with a lightness that is sometimes overlooked in accounts of his career that focus exclusively on the thundering revolutionary pamphleteer he will shortly become. He has humor. He has a gift for the satirical observation, for the well-placed irony that makes a serious point land with more force than earnest argument alone could achieve. He writes a piece on the legal status of women in marriage that manages to be simultaneously funny and genuinely angry, funny about the absurdity of the laws, genuinely angry about their consequences for the women who live within them. He writes about fashion with an amused contempt for the vanity of social performance that suggests a man who has spent enough time making corsets to understand exactly how much human dignity is sacrificed on the altar of fashionable appearance. Beneath all of this, beneath the range and the fluency and the occasional wit, something more serious is building. Because Philadelphia in the spring of 1775 is not a city in which it is possible to maintain, for very long, the detached perspective of the cultural commentator. The political situation is not detached. It is immediate, urgent, pressing itself against the windows of the print shop on Front Street with an insistence that no amount of editorial distance can indefinitely hold at bay. The news from Massachusetts arrives in Philadelphia the way bad news always travels in the 18th century, in fragments carried by riders on exhausted horses, gradually assembling itself from rumor and partial report into something like a coherent picture that is almost always worse than the most alarming early version suggested. In April of 1775, the picture that assembles itself is this. On the 19th of that month, on the village greens of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, British regular soldiers and colonial militiamen have exchanged fire. Men have died on both sides. The confrontation that everyone has been simultaneously dreading and, in some quarter, obscurely anticipating has occurred. The argument that has been conducted, for a decade, in the language of petitions and pamphlets and parliamentary debate has crossed a threshold from which, everyone understands instinctively, there is no simple retreat. Thomas Paine hears the news in Philadelphia and feels something shift inside him that is not surprise, because nothing about the logic of the situation has suggested that this moment would not arrive, but something closer to the particular clarification that occurs when a tension that has been building for a long time is finally, irrevocably resolved into action. The question of what is happening in the American colonies is no longer abstract. It is no longer a matter of constitutional theory or commercial grievance or the fine points of parliamentary authority. It is a question of war or the immediate proximity of war, and war, as Thomas has always understood, with the direct moral seriousness of a man who has seen enough of the world's cruelty to know that it is never clean or simple or cost-free, changes every calculation. Philadelphia responds to Lexington and Concord with an energy that Thomas finds both exhilarating and sobering. The city has been politically engaged for months. The Continental Congress, the committees of correspondence, the militia drilling in the squares. But the news from Massachusetts transforms engagement into urgency with a speed that is almost physical, almost visceral, as though the sound of those shots on the Lexington Green has been somehow transmitted through the ground itself and felt beneath the feet of every man and woman in the city. People gather in the streets and in the taverns and in the print shops, arguing with a new ferocity, a new sense that the time for argument may itself be running short. The Second Continental Congress convenes in Philadelphia in May of 1775, and the city becomes, if it was not already, the center of the colonial political world. The delegates arrive from 12 colonies, from Virginia and Massachusetts, from New York and South Carolina, from Pennsylvania itself, men of extraordinary individual distinction, men whose names will be written into the foundational documents of a new nation. John Adams and Samuel Adams from Massachusetts, George Washington from Virginia, Benjamin Franklin freshly returned from London, John Hancock from Massachusetts, Roger Sherman from Connecticut. They gather in the Pennsylvania State House on Chestnut Street, behind closed doors, in sessions of remarkable intensity and consequence, debating questions that no group of men in the English-speaking world has ever quite had to debate before in quite this form. Thomas Paine is not in the room. He is an immigrant of 7 months, an editor of a general interest magazine, a man with no official standing in the colonial political structure and no particular claim to be consulted on the great questions being decided a few streets from his print shop. But he is, in every other sense, as close to the center of things as it is possible to be without a seat at the table. He knows people who know the delegates. He moves through the same coffee houses and taverns where the arguments of the Congress spill out into less formal venues. He reads everything that is printed and much that is circulated in manuscript, and he listens with the particular quality of attention that has always been one of his defining gifts. Not the passive listening of a man absorbing information, but the active, searching listening of a man who is simultaneously evaluating what he hears against the framework of argument he is constantly, restlessly constructing in his own mind. He meets, in this period, several of the men who will matter most to the Revolution and to his own role in it. He meets Benjamin Rush, the Philadelphia physician and social reformer, a man of brilliance and passionate civic engagement who will become one of Thomas's most important early American friendships and, crucially, one of the most significant editorial voices in the creation of what will become common sense. Rush is a man who thinks in the same register as Thomas, who believes that reason, properly applied, can reform not just individual behavior but the fundamental structures of human society, and who has the doctor's unflinching willingness to look at what is actually wrong before prescribing what is actually needed. They recognize each other immediately, with the gratifying swiftness of like minds encountering genuine intellectual companionship for perhaps the first time in too long. Thomas meets other men in these months, printers and lawyers, merchants and militia officers, men who are navigating the distance between their loyalty to the British Crown, which most of them have sincerely felt for most of their lives, and their growing, uncomfortable, increasingly unavoidable conviction that the Crown has forfeited its claim on that loyalty through a pattern of behavior that no reasonable interpretation of justice can defend. This is the central emotional and intellectual drama of Philadelphia in 1775, and Thomas Paine watches it unfold in the faces and arguments of the men around him with the attention of someone who does not share their ambivalence, because he arrived without it. This is worth pausing to consider because it matters enormously to what Thomas will write and how he will write it. The men of the Continental Congress, Washington, Adams, Franklin, Jefferson, are men with deep, long, complicated relationships with the idea of British identity. They have lived their entire lives as British subjects. They have operated within British legal and political frameworks. They have, many of them, felt genuine pride in the British constitutional tradition and genuine affection for the idea of the empire, even as they have grown increasingly furious at its treatment of the colonies. Their movement toward independence is, for most of them, reluctant, a conclusion forced upon them by events rather than embraced as a first preference, and it carries with it a weight of loss and ambivalence that makes them, at crucial moments, hesitant to state the full implication of their own position. Thomas Paine has none of this. He is 7 months off the boat. He has no sentimental attachment to the British crown, quite the contrary given what the British government has done, specifically and repeatedly, to him. He has no investment in the idea of the British Empire as something admirable that has merely made some errors. He has the view from outside, the view of a man who has experienced British governance from the very bottom of its social structure, who has felt its indifference and its injustice personally and specifically, and who has therefore never needed to construct the elaborate emotional defenses that allow colonial gentlemen to maintain a complicated relationship with an institution that has treated them reasonably well until recently. He can see, with a clarity that the men inside the situation cannot quite achieve, what the situation actually is. And he is beginning to understand that this clarity, this freedom from the ambivalence and the sentiment and the class loyalty that clouds the vision of so many around him, is not merely an accident of his biography but a specific and deployable instrument. He can say what they cannot quite bring themselves to say. He can say it in language they cannot quite bring themselves to use, plain language, the language of the tradesman and the farmer and the ordinary working person, language that does not require a classical education to understand or a gentleman's drawing room to feel at home in. He begins to think about a pamphlet. The idea does not arrive fully formed, in a sudden flash of inspiration, the way that dramatic biographical accounts sometimes suggest. It accumulates. It builds from the arguments he is having in coffee houses and print shops, from the essays he is writing for the magazine, from the books he is reading, and he is reading voraciously in this period, working through the political philosophy that underpins the colonial cause with the systematic thoroughness of a man who needs to understand a thing from its foundations before he can build on it. He reads John Locke, whose arguments about natural rights and the social contract provide the theoretical scaffolding for most of what the colonial leadership is arguing. He reads the history of England, looking for the precedents that give colonial grievances their legal weight. He reads the pamphlets and essays of the colonial writers, absorbing their arguments and noticing, with the editor's professional eye, where those arguments are strongest and where they leave gaps that a more honest, more radical, more plainly stated case could fill. He talks to Benjamin Rush about it. Rush, who has been thinking along similar lines and who has the political instincts to understand that the moment is approaching when something more than legal argument will be needed, something that speaks not just to the minds but to the emotions and the moral convictions of ordinary people, encourages him. More than encourages. Rush becomes something like a collaborator in the early conceptual stages of what the pamphlet will be and what it will attempt to do. It is Rush who suggests, later, some of the organizational choices that will shape the final document. It is Rush who helps Thomas think through the question of audience, not just who will read this, but who needs to read it, who has not yet been reached by the arguments circulating in the drawing rooms and legislative chambers of the colonial elite. The answer to that question is, almost everyone. The vast majority of the colonial population, the farmers and artisans and sailors and shopkeepers and indentured servants who constitute the actual human substance of the 13 colonies, have not been reached by the arguments of the Continental Congress, because those arguments are conducted in a language and at a level of legal and philosophical abstraction that has very little purchase on the daily life of a man who is worried about his crops or his debts or his family's survival. Through another hard winter. The colonial leadership is making its case to Parliament, to the King, to the educated public on both sides of the Atlantic. No one is quite making the case to the people who will actually have to fight and die if the argument comes to the conclusion that everyone is increasingly afraid it is coming to. Thomas Paine decides that this is what he will do. He begins writing in the autumn of 1775. He writes in the evenings after the magazine work is done, in whatever lodgings or borrowed spaces his modest income affords him. He is not a wealthy man, has never been a wealthy man, and the editor's salary from the Pennsylvania magazine is sufficient for survival rather than comfort. He writes by firelight and candlelight, in the close, quiet hours when the city's daytime noise has settled and the streets outside carry only the occasional sound of a watchman's call or a horse's hooves on the cobblestones. He writes in the plain style that he has been developing his entire adult life, not the plain style of a man who lacks the capacity for ornamentation, but the plain style of a man who has decided, with full deliberation, that ornamentation is a form of dishonesty, a way of making weak arguments seem stronger than they are and strong arguments seem more complicated than they need to be. He is writing for the farmer in Pennsylvania and the artisan in Massachusetts and the sailor in Virginia. He is writing for the people who do not have Latin and do not need it, who have never read Locke and should not need to, who know what is just and what is unjust from the daily texture of their own experience and simply need someone to confirm, in language they recognize as their own, that what they know is true. He is writing, in a sense that he understands with complete and unsentimental mental clarity, for the people that England spent 37 years teaching him to be one of, and that America is now teaching him to speak for. The pamphlet does not yet have a title. It has arguments and evidence, and a structure that is taking shape with the organic logic of a thing that knows what it wants to be. It has a voice. His voice, the voice that the headstrong club nicknamed the ingenious exciseman, sharpened now by everything he has seen and read and thought since arriving in this city of red brick and clear winter light and enormous, terrifying, exhilarating possibility. Outside the window of wherever he is writing on these autumn evenings, Philadelphia goes about the complicated business of a city trying to understand what it is becoming. The delegates of the Continental Congress are still debating. The militia is still drilling. The newspapers are still printing. The arguments are still being had, in the taverns and the drawing rooms and the committee rooms, with the urgency of people who know that time is shortening and that the space for deliberation is closing around them like water around a ship in a narrowing channel. And Thomas Paine writes on Into the Night, building the case that will change everything. Chapter 6. Common Sense, the pamphlet that changed history, 1776. It is the 10th of January, 1776. Philadelphia is cold, genuinely bitterly cold, the kind of cold that comes off the Delaware in the deep heart of a Pennsylvania winter and finds every gap in a man's coat and every crack in a building's frame with the patient, systematic thoroughness of something that has all the time in the world. The streets are hard with frost. The river carries ice at its edges. The breath of the horses pulling carts along the cobblestones rises in small clouds that dissolve almost immediately into the sharp, clear air. It is a morning that makes the indoors feel like sanctuary and the outdoors feel like argument, as though the weather itself is making a point about the difficulty of the moment, the cost of whatever is coming, the cold hard reality of a world that does not warm itself on sentiment. On this morning in the print shop of Robert Bell on 3rd Street, a pamphlet is published. It has no author's name on the cover. It is attributed simply on its title page to written by an Englishman, a designation that is both accurate and, in the context of what the pamphlet argues, deeply, almost defiantly ironic. Its title is plain, 2 words only, the kind of title that seems almost too modest for what it contains, that gives nothing away, that presents itself to the potential reader with the quiet confidence of something that does not need to advertise its own importance because its importance will be immediately apparent to anyone who opens it. Common sense. To understand what common sense does, it helps to understand the moment into which it arrives. The winter of 1775 into 1776 is a moment of extraordinary, almost unbearable tension in the American colonies, a moment in which the logic of the situation has run far ahead of most people's willingness to follow it to its conclusion. The battles of Lexington and Concord have occurred. Bunker Hill has been fought, at a cost in British and American lives that has stripped away whatever remained of the idea that this dispute might be resolved through negotiation and goodwill. George Washington has taken command of the Continental Army outside Boston and is attempting, with the inadequate resources that the Continental Congress has been able to provide him, to maintain a siege of a British-held city with soldiers who are cold and hungry and increasingly uncertain about what exactly they are fighting for. Because this is the crucial thing. In January of 1776, the Continental Army is fighting officially, not for independence. It is fighting, in the language of its own leadership, in the resolutions of the Continental Congress, in the petitions still being sent to King George III with a diminishing hope of any constructive response, for the restoration of its rights as British subjects. It is fighting, in other words, for a reformed relationship with the Empire rather than a severed one, for the recognition of colonial grievances within the existing constitutional framework rather than the creation of an entirely new framework. Independence, the word itself, the idea itself, is still, in January of 1776, something that most of the colonial leadership approaches with extreme caution, as a possibility too radical, too dangerous, too irreversible to be named openly without risking the fragmentation of the coalition that has been so carefully assembled. Into this carefully maintained silence, Thomas Paine drops common sense like a stone into still water. He begins not with the immediate crisis but with first principles, with the most fundamental questions about the nature of government and society, questions that most political writers of his era would take for granted or address only in passing, as context for the more specific legal and constitutional arguments that follow. Thomas does not take them for granted. He starts from the very beginning, from the question of why human beings form societies at all, and he answers it with a simplicity that is, on reflection, quietly radical. Society is formed because people need each other, because no individual can provide for all of his own needs, and because cooperation produces outcomes that isolation cannot. Society, in this account, is a positive good, a natural expression of human interdependence. Government, on the other hand, is something different entirely. Government, Thomas argues, is not a positive good but a necessary evil, made necessary by the inability of human beings to govern themselves perfectly, required not because people are good but because they are sometimes not good enough. This distinction, between society which we create because we want to and government which we create because we have to, seems at first like a philosophical nicety, the kind of theoretical throat-clearing that precedes the real argument. But it is, in fact, the structural foundation on which everything else in the pamphlet is built. If government is a necessary evil rather than a positive good, then the question of how much government is appropriate becomes not a question of tradition or precedent or inherited constitutional arrangement, but a question of function. Does this government do what government is supposed to do? Does it protect the people it governs or does it harm them? And if it harms them, if it has demonstrably, repeatedly, systematically failed in the basic function that justifies its existence, then what obligation do the governed have to continue submitting to it? None is Thomas Paine's answer. And he arrives at it not with the hesitant, heavily qualified language of a man afraid of his own conclusion, but with the plain, direct, almost conversational confidence of someone stating a fact that ought to have been obvious long before now. Then he turns to the monarchy. And here, the pamphlet does something that no previous colonial political document has quite done, something that makes it not merely more radical than what came before but different in kind, operating at a different register, aimed at a different audience with a different and more devastating rhetorical strategy. The colonial leadership has been making its arguments, by and large, in the language of English constitutional law, citing Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights and the precedents of parliamentary authority, arguing that what the Crown is doing to the colonies violates the specific legal protections that English subjects have won over centuries of struggle. These are valid arguments. They are also arguments that require a certain familiarity with the history of English constitutionalism to fully appreciate, that speak most directly to men who have been educated in the law and the history that the arguments invoke, and that leave largely untouched the more fundamental question of whether the institution of monarchy itself, not this particular king, not this particular ministry, but the whole idea of hereditary rule, is compatible with the principles of justice and human dignity that the colonial cause is simultaneously invoking. Thomas Paine attacks the monarchy directly. He attacks it not on constitutional grounds but on logical and moral ones, with the full force of the plain, clear, unsparing language that is his most powerful instrument. He points out that the institution of hereditary rule, the idea that the capacity to govern a nation should descend from father to son regardless of the son's fitness for the role, is, when examined without the reverence that tradition has draped over it, simply absurd. He invokes the Bible, which his Quaker upbringing has given him a thorough knowledge of, pointing out that even the Old Testament treats the desire for a king with deep skepticism, that when the Israelites asked the prophet Samuel for a king, God's response was to warn them, in terms of considerable specificity, exactly how a king would treat them. He traces the origins of European monarchy to its historical reality: conquest, violence, the imposition of power by force, dressed up over centuries in the ceremonial language of divine right, and points out that the fine clothes do not change what is wearing them. He writes about King George III with a directness that takes the breath away. Not the careful, legalistic directness of a lawyer making a case, but the blunt, personal directness of a man who has had enough of pretending that an institution deserves respect it has not earned. The king, in Thomas Paine's rendering, is not a tragic figure wrongly advised by corrupt ministers, which is the more charitable colonial interpretation, the one that allows continued deference to the crown while blaming its servants. The king is the problem. Monarchy is the problem. And no petition, however eloquent, and no negotiation, however skillfully conducted, will produce a lasting remedy, because the problem is structural, built into the institution itself, and only the removal of the institution can remove the problem. The argument is breathtaking in its simplicity. It is also, for the men of the Continental Congress reading it in their lodgings on these cold January evenings, genuinely frightening, not because it is wrong but because it is so clearly, so irresistibly, so unanswerably right, and because being right in this particular way commits them to a course of action from which there is no retreat. He then turns to the question of independence itself, the word that the colonial leadership has been circling for months without quite landing on, and he treats it not as a radical departure or a dangerous gamble but as a simple logical consequence of everything that has already happened. The colonies and Britain, he argues, have interests that are not merely different but fundamentally incompatible. Britain is a European power with European entanglements, drawn into wars and disputes by alliances and ambitions that have nothing to do with America and everything to do with the dynastic and commercial competitions of the Old World. Every time Britain goes to war, and Britain goes to war with considerable regularity, America is dragged in, not because American interests are served by the conflict, but because America is attached to a power whose interests frequently conflict with America's own. Independence, in this account, is not a rebellion against a natural arrangement but a recognition of a natural reality, that a continent cannot indefinitely be governed from an island, and that the attempt to maintain this arrangement serves the island at the expense of the continent. He addresses the practical objections. He knows they are coming because he has heard them in every coffee house and drawing room in Philadelphia for the past year. America is too weak to fight Britain. America has no navy. America cannot survive economically without the trade connections that membership in the empire provides. America is not ready. Thomas Paine takes each of these objections seriously. He is never a man who dismisses the practical when the practical is genuinely at stake, and he dismantles them, one by one, with the methodical efficiency of a man who has done the arithmetic and is not afraid of what it shows. America is not too weak. The colonies have resources, timber and iron and agricultural abundance, that Britain, a small island, cannot match. The colonies have the advantage of fighting on their own ground, for their own homes, with a motivation that no mercenary army and no press-gang sailor can equal. America can build a navy. The raw materials are here, in the forests of New England and the Chesapeake, in quantities that Britain must import at enormous expense. And as for trade, independence does not mean isolation. A free America can trade with every nation in the world, unconstrained by British commercial regulations that have always served British interests at American expense. The commercial argument for remaining in the empire is, when examined honestly, an argument for American poverty in exchange for British prosperity. He makes the case for now. This is perhaps the most emotionally powerful element of the entire pamphlet, the argument that the moment, precisely this moment, is the right moment, the necessary moment, the moment that will not come again in the same form. He writes about the generations that will follow, about the children and grandchildren who will inherit whatever choice the present generation makes or fails to make. He writes about the particular moral weight that falls on people who happen to be alive at a hinge point in history, who have it in their power to begin the world over again, as he puts it, in a phrase that is perhaps the most quoted and most resonant of his entire career, a phrase that compresses into 8 words a vision of human possibility so expansive that it has never quite stopped echoing. The pamphlet is 47 pages long. It sells for 2 shillings. And it sells, immediately, explosively, in quantities that no publication in colonial America has ever approached. The first edition sells out within days. A second edition follows almost immediately. Then a third. Printers in other cities reprint it without authorization, which Thomas does not only permit but actively encourages. Because he has not written this to make money, he will donate his share of the proceeds to the Continental Army, but to change minds, and changing minds requires the widest possible distribution. Within 3 months, an estimated 100,000 copies are in circulation in a colonial population of approximately 2.5 million people. When adjusted for population, this is a rate of distribution that no subsequent American publication has ever matched. Not in the age of newspapers, not in the age of radio, not in the age of television. It is, in the most literal sense, the most widely read piece of political writing in American history. It reaches not just the educated and the politically engaged but the farmer and the artisan and the militiaman, the people Thomas has always been writing for, the people who needed not a constitutional argument but a moral one, stated in a language they recognize as their own. The response is not universally celebratory. There are those, loyalists, conservatives, men who have built their lives and fortunes on the existing arrangement, who read Common Sense with alarm and fury, who respond with pamphlets of their own arguing that Paine is dangerous, reckless, a recently arrived immigrant with no right to tell Americans what their relationship with their mother country should be. These responses are earnest and occasionally intelligent and completely ineffective, not because Thomas Paine is too powerful to be argued with, but because he has chosen his moment with the unerring instinct of a man who has spent his entire life watching for the exact moment when plain truth, stated plainly, will carry everything before it. John Adams reads it. Adams, who will later develop a complicated and somewhat ungenerous relationship with Thomas Paine's legacy, nonetheless acknowledges in letters of the period that Common Sense has accomplished something that the more measured and constitutionally careful arguments of the colonial leadership have not managed. It has moved people. It has taken the abstract legal and philosophical arguments for resistance and translated them into something felt as well as understood, something that operates on the gut and the heart as well as the mind. George Washington reads it to his troops. He writes that it has worked a powerful change in the minds of many men. Benjamin Franklin, who sent Thomas Paine to America with a letter of introduction and who could not have fully imagined the use to which his recommendation would be put, reads it with the satisfaction of a man who backed something that has exceeded every expectation. Thomas himself, in the days and weeks after publication, exists in a state that is difficult to describe from the outside and that he himself never quite describes from the inside. He is not a man who writes extensively about his own emotional life. His prose is directed always outward at the world and its arrangements, rather than inward at the self and its responses. But something has happened to him in the publication of Common Sense that is evident even in the sparse record. He has found, at last and completely, the thing he was made to do. The corset-maker's son from Thetford, the twice-dismissed excise officer, the failed shopkeeper, the widower, the bankrupt, the immigrant, all of those incomplete and insufficient versions of himself have resolved, in the 47 pages of this pamphlet, into something coherent and purposeful and, in the fullest sense of the word, necessary. The Continental Congress debates through the spring. The arguments that Thomas has made in Common Sense have shifted the ground beneath the debate in ways that cannot be easily undone, have made the moderate positions harder to maintain, have made the case for continued reconciliation with the Crown seem, to an increasing majority, not merely impractical but morally evasive. Men who were not ready to say the word independence in January are finding, in March and April and May, that the word has become unavoidable, that Common Sense has done the work of making it not just thinkable but necessary. In June, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduces a resolution to the Congress declaring that the United Colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. A committee is appointed to draft a formal declaration. On that committee are John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert Livingston of New York, and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, who will do the primary drafting with the elegant, classical precision of a man trained in exactly the kind of formal rhetoric that Thomas Paine has spent his entire career deliberately avoiding. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and Paine's Common Sense are different documents in almost every stylistic register. One written in the elevated, carefully structured language of Enlightenment philosophy addressed to the world, the other in the plain, direct, conversational language of common humanity addressed to ordinary people. But they are, at their deepest level, making the same argument. And the Declaration could not have been adopted, could not have been written, in the atmosphere that would have made its writing possible, without the ground that common sense prepared. On the 4th of July, 1776, the Continental Congress formally adopts the Declaration of Independence. It is a Thursday. In Philadelphia, the news is received with the ringing of bells and the lighting of bonfires and the particular, complex, almost disbelieving joy of people who have talked about something for so long that the reality of its arrival feels both inevitable and impossible. Thomas Paine is in the city. He is 39 years old. He has been in America for less than 2 years. He has, in those 2 years, helped to change the world. But he knows, because he is, above everything, a realist, a man whose plain speaking extends to his own situation as fully as to the situations of kings and empires, that changing the world on paper and changing it in reality are two different things, and that the distance between the Declaration adopted in Philadelphia and the independence actually secured in the field is not a distance that pamphlets alone can close. There is a war. There is a war that is going badly, that will continue to go badly for years, that will demand of the people who have committed themselves to it a quality of endurance and sacrifice that no document, however powerful, can by itself sustain. Thomas Paine understands this. He picks up his pen and he prepares to do what he has always done, to find the words that the moment needs, to say them plainly, to say them for the people who need them most. He is not done. He has barely begun. Chapter 7. The American Crisis and Wartime Service, 1776 to 1779. The autumn of 1776 does not belong to the optimism of July. It does not carry the bells and bonfires and the almost giddy disbelief of independence declared and the future thrown open like a window onto clear air. The autumn of 1776 belongs to something considerably harder and considerably colder, to the reality of a war that is being lost, to the specific, grinding, demoralizing reality of an army in retreat, of men who believed in something and are now discovering that belief, however genuine and however justified, does not by itself stop a musket ball or fill an empty stomach or keep a man warm when the temperature drops and the blankets run out and the enlistment that brought him here is about to expire and the road home is right there, visible and possible and calling to him with everything that home means to a man who has been too long away from it. Thomas Paine is with the army when this is happening. Not as a soldier. He is nearly 40 years old, not a young man by the standards of the era, and his gifts are manifestly of a different kind than those required to march and fight. He has joined the forces around New York in August of 1776 as a volunteer aide-de-camp to General Nathanael Greene, one of Washington's most capable and trusted officers, a man of Rhode Island who combines natural military intelligence with the Quaker-influenced moral seriousness that Thomas finds immediately congenial. The role gives him access to the men, to the officers, to the daily unvarnished reality of what the Continental Army actually is in the late summer and autumn of 1776 as opposed to what it appeared to be in the hopeful rhetoric of the spring. What it actually is in trouble. The British have arrived in force, a force of a kind that the colonial leadership, for all their preparation, has not quite been ready for in its full, professional, overwhelming reality. General William Howe commands an army of approximately 32,000 men, British regulars and Hessian mercenaries, trained soldiers equipped with the full logistical support of the greatest military empire the world has yet produced. Washington commands, in theory, a comparable number, but the theory and the reality are very different things. His men are militia and volunteers, drawn from 13 colonies with 13 different traditions and 13 different levels of enthusiasm for the specific business of standing in formation under fire and not running. They are short of weapons and shorter of ammunition. They are short of food and shorter of clothing. They are long on courage and dangerously short of the kind of disciplined, professional military experience that turns courage into tactical effectiveness. The Battle of Long Island in late August is a disaster. The British outmaneuver Washington's forces with the cool efficiency of a professional army conducting the kind of operation it has been specifically trained and organized to conduct, and the Continental Army is driven back across the East River to Manhattan in a retreat that is skillfully executed. The nighttime crossing of the river in small boats being one of the genuinely impressive operational achievements of Washington's early generalship, but is a retreat nonetheless, and the men who make it know it. Then Manhattan itself becomes untenable. Then the army is driven north, through Westchester into New Jersey, the British pressing steadily forward and Washington's forces falling back, steadily, with a discipline that is admirable and a trajectory that is alarming. Thomas Paine marches with the retreat. He marches through the New Jersey countryside in the November rain, through towns whose residents watch the passing army with expressions that range from sympathy to anxiety to the particular calculating neutrality of people who are beginning to wonder which side they should be on when the smoke clears. He sees the men around him, the soldiers of this army that he has helped, in some measure, to call into existence through the arguments of common sense. And what he sees is not a broken army but an endangered one, an army that is cold and hungry and exhausted and demoralized, that has been retreating for months and has not yet had a victory to set against the accumulating weight of its defeats. He sees something else too. He sees that these men have not quit. They are retreating, but they are retreating as an army, maintaining formation, maintaining discipline, maintaining the organizational coherence that makes a retreating force something other than a rout. Washington holds them together through the force of his own immovable presence, through the particular quality of leadership that expresses itself not in inspiring speeches but in the willingness to be seen, by every man in the army, to be exactly where the danger is, doing exactly what the army requires, without flinching and without complaint. The men watch their commander and they do not quit. They are close to quitting. But they do not. Thomas watches all of this and he does what he has always done when the world presents him with a truth that needs to be said. He finds paper. He writes. He writes by firelight, in the field, in the inadequate shelter of whatever building or barn or stretch of open ground the army happens to be occupying on a given night. He writes with the urgency of a man who understands that words have a specific and limited window in which they can do their most important work, and that the window for these particular words is right now, tonight, in this moment of maximum danger and maximum doubt, before the army dissolves or surrenders or simply walks home through the December dark. He is not writing for posterity. He is writing for the men around him, for the civilians in the towns the army has passed through, for the members of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia who are themselves, at this moment, packing their papers and preparing to flee the city ahead of the advancing British. He writes, "These are the times that try men's souls." The sentence arrives on the page with the force of something that has been waiting to be written. Spare, direct, perfectly balanced, carrying within its 10 words the entire emotional weight of the moment without a single syllable of excess. It does not argue. It does not explain. It simply names, with the precision of a surgeon's cut, the exact nature of what is being endured and what is being demanded. These are the times that try men's souls. Not comfortable times, not easy times, not times for the uncommitted or the faint of heart. Times that try, that test, that strain, that demand from the soul everything the soul has, and the implication hanging in the air after the sentence ends, is that the soul which submits to this trying will come through it, as tested things do, stronger and more certain of its own nature than it was before. He continues. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. He is speaking directly to the soldiers around him, in language that they recognize as addressed specifically to them, not to the educated classes who can decode constitutional argument, not to the legislators debating in their chambers, but to the men in the field, the men with cold feet and empty stomachs and the road home visible from where they stand. He is telling them, in the plainest terms available to him, that what they are doing matters, that the difficulty of it is not an argument against continuing but an argument for it, that the endurance itself is the thing, that to stand now is to be remembered, to be loved, to be part of something that will outlast the cold and the hunger and the retreat and everything else that this terrible autumn has produced. He calls the piece The American Crisis, and it is published on December 19, 1776, in the Pennsylvania Journal. Washington orders it read aloud to the troops. It is read in the camps along the Delaware River, where the army is encamped on the Pennsylvania side, watching the ice form at the river's edges, waiting for something. Some turn, some change, some event that will shift the terrible momentum of the past several months. The men listen. The words move through the camps with a particular, almost physical effect of language that finds people exactly where they are, not slightly to one side of where they are, not slightly above or below, but exactly there, at the precise point of greatest doubt and greatest need. 6 days after the first crisis paper is published and read to the troops, on the night of December 25, 1776, George Washington leads the Continental Army back across the Delaware River in darkness and freezing rain and attacks the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey, at dawn. The attack is a complete surprise. The Hessians, who are not the careless and hungover soldiers of later legend but experienced professionals who have nonetheless been worn down by weeks of active campaigning in unfamiliar territory, are overwhelmed in a battle that lasts less than an hour. 900 prisoners are taken. The Continental Army has its first significant victory of the war. It is impossible to draw a straight causal line from Thomas Paine's words to Washington's crossing. Military operations do not work that way, and Washington's decision to attack was the product of strategic calculation and logistical opportunity as much as of morale. But it is equally impossible to entirely separate the two things. To insist that the words read to those men on the Delaware had no effect on the quality of what they were willing to do when the order came. Thomas himself never claims too much. But he never denies the connection either, and the men who were there, who heard the words and then made the crossing, do not seem to have felt the connection was accidental. The crisis papers continue. Thomas writes them across the arc of the war, 13 papers in all, plus several related pieces, each one addressed to a specific moment in the conflict with the tactical precision of a writer who understands that different moments require different arguments and different tones. He writes Crisis 2 as a direct address to Lord Howe, the British Commander-in-Chief, dissecting with cold logic the British strategy and its contradictions. He writes Crisis 3 as a defense of the Quakers, whose pacifism has led them to decline military service and who are being accused, not entirely without basis, of providing aid and comfort to the British occupation. He writes with an eye always on the specific audience he needs to reach at the specific moment he is writing, adjusting his register, sometimes indignant, sometimes sardonic, sometimes patient and explanatory, to the requirements of the moment rather than to any fixed rhetorical posture. He also takes on an official role. In 1777, Thomas Paine is appointed secretary to the Committee for Foreign Affairs of the Continental Congress, a position of genuine importance and genuine difficulty, at the intersection of the diplomatic and political management of a war being conducted on multiple fronts simultaneously. The role requires him to handle correspondence with American representatives abroad, including Silas Deane and Arthur Lee, the two American commissioners in France who are navigating the complex and enormously consequential question of French support for the American cause. He manages documents, drafts correspondence, keeps records, and maintains the confidentiality of communications that, if intercepted by the British, could do serious damage to American diplomatic interests. He is, it must be said, a better writer than he is an administrator. The skills that make him the most effective political pamphleteer in the English-speaking world, the directness, the willingness to name what he sees regardless of the political consequences, the impatience with obfuscation and institutional dishonesty, are not the skills most conducive to the delicate, patient, strategically nuanced management of diplomatic correspondence. He does the work conscientiously, but it is not work that fully engages the best of what he is. And then comes the Silas Deane affair, and everything becomes considerably more complicated. Silas Deane is a Connecticut merchant and lawyer who has been serving as one of America's diplomatic representatives in France, where he has been instrumental in arranging crucial French military supplies for the Continental Army. He is also a man of flexible commercial ethics, accused by his fellow Commissioner Arthur Lee of using his diplomatic position to enrich himself through private commercial transactions conducted alongside his official duties. The accusations are serious. They go, in Lee's telling, beyond mere opportunism into something that looks uncomfortably like corruption at the heart of American foreign diplomacy at the most critical moment of the war. Dean returns to America in 1778 to answer the charges and defends himself publicly, with considerable force and some success, arguing that he has served America faithfully and that the accusations against him are politically motivated. Thomas Paine, who has access to the confidential documents of the Committee for Foreign Affairs and who has formed a view of the situation that aligns with Lee's version rather than Dean's, does something that his position absolutely forbids. He publishes a letter in the Pennsylvania Packet in December of 1778 that draws on confidential government documents to support the accusations against Dean. The response is immediate and severe. Gérard, the French minister to the United States, France being now America's formal military ally, following the Treaty of Alliance signed in February of 1778, protests formally to the Continental Congress, because Thomas's letter has revealed details about the nature of French assistance to America that France has been at considerable pains to keep confidential, having provided that assistance before the formal alliance and before it was willing to be publicly seen as hostile to Britain. The Congress, dependent on French support and mortified by the breach of diplomatic confidence, demands Thomas's resignation. He resigns in January of 1779. He is deeply convinced that he was right about Dean, and the historical record, as it has been assembled over the subsequent 2.5 centuries, suggests that he was. But being right, as Thomas Paine has had occasion to notice before, is not always sufficient protection against the consequences of the manner in which one is right. He has sacrificed his position, his income, and a considerable amount of his political standing in the American establishment in the service of an argument that was probably correct and was definitely improper in its method of expression. It is a pattern that will recur in his life with a consistency that is sometimes maddening and always, in some sense, characteristic. He is a man constitutionally incapable of observing an injustice and declining to name it, regardless of what naming it will cost him. He is out of office. He is, once again, without reliable income. He takes work where he can find it, as a clerk to Owen Biddle, a Philadelphia merchant, for a period, doing the routine administrative work that the former secretary to the Committee for Foreign Affairs must now perform in the humbling proximity of a commercial counting house. He writes. He continues to write, crisis papers and political essays and occasional pieces, but the writing alone does not pay enough to live on, and the combined effect of the Dean affair and his resignation has cooled the warmth that the Philadelphia establishment previously extended to him. But he is not done with the war. He will never be done with the war, not while the war continues, not while there are arguments to be made and men to be persuaded and causes to be defended that the country he has adopted needs him to defend. In 1780, when the war enters one of its most desperate phases, when the Continental Army is again near collapse, when enlistments are expiring and funds are exhausted and the Congress is unable to pay its soldiers or supply them with the equipment they need, Thomas Paine does something that is not writing but is, in its own way, equally characteristic. He donates $500 of his own money he does not really have, money borrowed against future earnings, to a fund for the relief of the Continental Army. He is not a wealthy man. He has never been a wealthy man. The gesture is not symbolic in the way that a wealthy man's donation might be symbolic. It is actual sacrifice, the giving of actual resources that he actually needs, in the service of a cause that he actually believes in, to people who are actually suffering for want of what he is actually giving. He then goes further. He helps to organize what becomes known as the Pennsylvania Bank, a private lending institution established specifically to provide the Continental Army with the supplies that the official government finances can no longer fund. It is not the gesture of a man who writes about sacrifice from a comfortable distance. It is the gesture of a man who means it. Through these years of war, through the campaigns and the retreats and the desperate winters and the occasional brilliant victories that keep the cause alive when everything else argues for its death, Thomas Paine remains what he has been since that first cold January morning when common sense appeared on the streets of Philadelphia. The voice. Not the general, not the statesman, not the diplomat. The voice. The man who says, in the language that reaches the people who most need to be reached, what the moment requires to be said. He says it across the arc of these years with a consistency of commitment and a clarity of moral purpose that the more comfortable, more celebrated, more officially recognized figures of the American founding cannot always match. Washington fights with magnificent tenacity. Adams argues with formidable legal intelligence. Jefferson writes with transcendent eloquence. But Thomas Paine, the corset-maker's son, the twice-dismissed exciseman, the immigrant of 7 months when common sense changed everything, Thomas Paine speaks to the people, always to the people, in the language of the people, about the things that the people most need to understand about what they are doing and why it matters and what it will cost and why the cost is worth it. He is 42 years old as the decade turns. The war is not yet over. The world he is trying to help make is not yet made. But it is closer, immeasurably, improbably, extraordinarily closer than it was when he stepped off a ship at the Philadelphia docks in 1774, barely alive, carried on a stretcher, with nothing but a letter in his pocket and a mind that the world had not yet fully met. He picks up his pen again. He always picks up his pen again. That is, finally, what Thomas Paine is. Not a soldier, not a statesman, not a diplomat. A man with a pen who means what he writes and writes what he means, in the plainest language available to him, for the people who need it most, at the moments when they need it most, regardless of what it costs him. It has already cost him a great deal. It will cost him more. But the pen goes down on the page and the words come, and they are, as they have always been, exactly right. Chapter 8. Public Good, Diplomacy, and Return to Europe, 1780 to 1787. The war does not end cleanly. Wars rarely do. They taper and diminish and shift in character before they conclude, moving from the acute crisis of open battle to the chronic exhaustion of extended siege and negotiation and the slow, grinding work of sustaining an army and a government and a people through years of sacrifice that were supposed to be over by now. By 1780, the American Revolution has been going on for 5 years, and the people who are living inside it, the soldiers and the farmers and the merchants and the mothers and the politicians and the printers, are tired in the way that only a very long, very costly, very uncertain undertaking can make people tired. Not broken, not defeated, but tired, in the bone, in the spirit, in the particular deep reserve that human beings draw on when everything else has been spent. Thomas Paine is tired too. He does not say so directly. He is not a man who anatomizes his own exhaustion for the benefit of his readers, but it is present in the record of these years in the way that fatigue is always present in the record of a man's actions when his actions reveal the effort that ordinary forward movement requires. He has been writing and arguing and agitating and sacrificing without pause for 6 years. He has given his earnings to the cause and his time to the cause and his reputation to the cause, and the cause, though it continues and though it is winning in ways that are not always immediately visible in the daily grind of the war, has not yet delivered the definitive resolution that would allow a man to lay down his instruments and rest. He writes in 1780, a pamphlet called Public Good. It is, in subject matter and in ambition, quite different from anything he has produced before, not a rallying cry, not a moral argument about the fundamental principles of human freedom, but a detailed, carefully researched examination of a specific and complicated legal and political question: the ownership and governance of the western lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The question matters enormously. The territory stretching westward from the existing states to the Mississippi River is, in 1780, a vast and largely unsettled expanse whose ownership and governance is being contested by several of the states, each of which has ancient colonial charters making competing claims to the territory. Virginia, in particular, is asserting claims to enormous tracts of western land on the basis of its colonial charter, claims that the smaller states without western land ambitions, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, are contesting with increasing bitterness, arguing that the western territory should be treated as common property of all the states rather than the exclusive possession of a few. Thomas enters this dispute with an argument that is, characteristically, more radical than what either side has been willing to state. He argues that the western lands belong to none of the states individually, that the colonial charters on which Virginia and other states base their claims are invalid, derived from Crown grants that were themselves improper dispositions of territory that the Crown had no legitimate right to grant. The Western lands, in Thomas's argument, are the common inheritance of the American people as a whole, all of them existing in future, and should be governed by a national authority rather than parceled out to individual states whose particular interests will inevitably conflict with the national good. It is, in its way, a nationalistic argument, an argument for the primacy of the Union over the individual states, for the idea that America is not merely a coalition of separate political entities but a single people with a single future, whose governance requires institutions capable of thinking and acting at the national scale. This is not the dominant view in 1780, in a political culture that is deeply suspicious of centralized power and deeply committed to the autonomy of the individual states. It is, however, the argument that history will eventually vindicate, the argument whose logic will find its fullest expression in the Constitution of 1787 and the Federal Republic it establishes. The pamphlet is well received among those who share its nationalist orientation and coolly received by those who do not. Virginia, understandably, is not pleased. But Thomas does not write to please Virginia or any other state. He writes to advance what he believes is the correct argument, and the correctness of an argument has never seemed to him a less compelling reason to make it simply because the people who most need to hear it are likely to find it inconvenient. But the deeper current of these years, the thing that is shaping Thomas's life and thinking most profoundly in the early 1780s, is not the question of the Western lands. It is a growing awareness, sharpened by everything he has observed in his 6 years as an American, of the intimate connection between political freedom and economic condition. He has seen in the daily life of the Revolution how poverty undermines the capacity for self-governance, how men who are hungry and cold and uncertain of their economic survival cannot fully exercise the civic virtues that a republic requires. He has seen how the failure to pay the Continental soldiers is not merely a logistical problem but a moral one, a betrayal of the people who have borne the actual physical cost of the freedom that others enjoy from a comfortable distance. These observations are moving him, slowly, toward a set of ideas about the relationship between political rights and economic rights that will not reach their full expression until the rights of man, a decade hence. But they are present in his thinking in these years, in the pamphlets and essays he writes, in the conversations he has with the men around him, in the particular quality of moral attention he brings to the daily evidence of how the new republic is organizing, and sometimes failing to organize, its responsibilities to its own people. He is also, in these years, increasingly preoccupied with a subject that has fascinated him since the London lecture halls of his 20s, the relationship between human reason and the natural world, between the evidence of the senses and the conclusions of the mind, between what can be observed and what can be deduced from observation. He is thinking about science, about the practical application of scientific understanding to the material improvement of human life, about the iron bridge he has been designing in his spare hours since arriving in America, about the relationship between technical innovation and social progress. The bridge is not a metaphor, though it functions as one in the story of his life with an aptness that he would probably both appreciate and distrust as too convenient. It is an actual engineering project, a design for a single-arch iron bridge that Thomas has been developing with the kind of absorbed, detailed, technically engaged enthusiasm that characterizes his approach to any problem that genuinely captures his interest. He has been studying the architecture of natural bridges, the spider's web, the catenary curve formed by a hanging chain, and applying the principles he observes to the problem of spanning the Schuylkill River near Philadelphia, which floods regularly and has defeated several attempts at conventional timber bridge construction. The iron bridge is an idea ahead of its time, ahead of the available metallurgy, ahead of the engineering science that would eventually make such structures routine, but sound in its principles and remarkable in its conception from a man whose formal scientific education was, by any standard measure, extremely limited. He works on the design throughout the early 1780s, consulting with engineers and scientists, refining his calculations, building models that he demonstrates to interested observers with the pride of a man who has solved a problem that others have given up on. The bridge will eventually take him back to Europe. But first, the war concludes. The victory at Yorktown in October of 1781, where Washington and his French allies trap Cornwallis's British army on a Virginia peninsula and force the surrender of 8,000 men in what proves to be the decisive military engagement of the war, does not end the conflict immediately. The formal negotiations are long and complicated, conducted in Paris through 1782 and into 1783 by Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and John Jay, navigating the competing interests of France and Spain and Britain with the patient diplomatic skill that the enormity of the stakes demands. But Yorktown ends the war in the sense that matters most. It ends the possibility of a British military victory, and with that possibility gone, the question shifts from whether America will be independent to what terms that independence will be recognized on. The Treaty of Paris is signed in September of 1783. The British Crown formally acknowledges the independence of the United States of America, recognizes American sovereignty over the territory east of the Mississippi, and withdraws its forces from American soil. It is, by any measure, a more comprehensive victory than even the most optimistic colonial leaders dared to hope for in the dark winter of 1776 when Thomas Paine was riding by firelight with retreating soldiers around him. Thomas receives the news with the satisfaction of a man who has been present at the creation of something unprecedented, who has, in the most direct and literal sense, helped to argue a nation into existence. But satisfaction for Thomas Paine has never been a resting state. The war is over. The political question, independence, has been resolved. The moral and social questions that independence was supposed to answer, that the revolution was supposed to make it possible to begin answering, are still very much open. He looks around at the new republic and he sees, with the same unsparing clarity that has always characterized his vision, the distance between what has been achieved and what was promised. The Declaration of Independence spoke of the self-evident equality of all men and the inalienable rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. The republic that has been constructed in the wake of that declaration has not yet made good on those promises for the enslaved people who constitute a fifth of the population. It has not yet fully made good on them for the soldiers who fought the war and have not been paid. It has not yet fully made good on them for the poor, whose political rights are constrained by property qualifications that make a mockery of the universal principles in whose name the revolution was fought. Thomas knows all of this. He is not naive about the gap between the rhetoric and the reality. He is, in some ways, the person most responsible for creating the rhetoric, and the gap is therefore not something he can easily ignore. But he is also a pragmatist, a man who has spent enough time in the actual machinery of political change to understand that the distances between principles and their realization are covered incrementally, that the perfect is the enemy of the good, and that the republic as it exists is a foundation on which the republic as it should be can be built, if the people who understand what building it requires are willing to do the long, unglamorous, incremental work. He is also broke. He is, in the years immediately following the peace, in a condition of financial difficulty that is both chronic and somewhat absurd, given the scale of what he has contributed to the American cause. He has donated his earnings, declined personal profit from common sense, spent his own money on soldiers' relief, and arrived at the peace of 1783 without property, without significant savings, and without the kind of institutional position that provides a man of his age and circumstances with the security that approaching middle age requires. His friends know this. The network of men who understand what Thomas Paine has done for America, Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, Madison, understand that the Republic has a debt to its most effective propagandist that has not been paid in any formal or commensurate way. The Congress is petitioned. The state of New York, in a gesture of particular generosity, grants Thomas a farm at New Rochelle, confiscated from a loyalist during the war, 300 acres of decent land with a house and outbuildings that provide him, for the first time in his life, with something approaching genuine material security. Pennsylvania grants him £500. Congress votes him $3,000. It is not a fortune. But it is, for a man who has never had much, something more than he has ever had before. He settles at the New Rochelle farm with the complicated feelings of a man for whom rootedness has always been slightly alien. He has moved through the world for too long, has been too consistently defined by forward momentum and intellectual restlessness, to settle easily into the rhythms of a farmer's life. He keeps the farm. He values it. But he does not become a farmer. He remains what he has always been: a writer, a thinker, an arguer, a man whose natural habitat is the page and the conversation rather than the field and the harvest. And the bridge keeps calling to him. He has the design. He has the models. He needs capital and engineering expertise that America in 1785 does not quite have in the form he requires. The most advanced ironworking in the world is in Britain, in the foundries of the Midlands, in the workshops of men who have been pushing the boundaries of what iron can do since the construction of the iron bridge at Coalbrookdale in 1779, that astonishing single-arch structure spanning the River Severn that has changed permanently what engineers believe is possible in metal. If Thomas wants to build his bridge, and he wants this with a persistence that is one of the most endearing and occasionally maddening qualities of his character, he needs to go to Britain. He also needs to go to France. The intellectual life of Paris in the mid-1780s is, for a man of Thomas Paine's interests and convictions, one of the most stimulating environments in the world, a city in the full flower of the Enlightenment, buzzing with philosophical debate and scientific discovery and the particular electric energy of a culture that is beginning, without quite knowing it, to approach one of history's great ruptures. The philosophers of the French Enlightenment, Voltaire and Rousseau and their successors, have been asking the same fundamental questions about the nature of authority and the rights of human beings that Thomas has been asking in English, and the conversation between these traditions is one that Thomas wants to be part of. He also has friends in France. Benjamin Franklin has returned from Paris after his triumphant decade as American minister, but the relationships he has built there, with scientists and philosophers and the progressive aristocrats who gather in the salons where French intellectual life does its most important work, remain available to Thomas through Franklin's introductions and recommendations. Thomas Jefferson has succeeded Franklin as American minister to France, and Jefferson is a man whose intellectual interests and reforming instincts align with Thomas's own in ways that make Paris, with Jefferson in residence, a particularly attractive destination. He sails for Europe in April of 1787. He is 50 years old. He has been in America for 13 years. He leaves behind the farm at New Rochelle, the friendships of the Philadelphia years, the extraordinary chapter of his life that began with a stretcher on a Philadelphia dock and produced, among much else, the pamphlet that helped ignite a revolution and the crisis papers that helped sustain it through its darkest passages. He does not think of himself as leaving permanently. He is going to pursue the bridge, to test the model at the iron works of Yorkshire and to seek the investment and engineering partnership that will turn his design into a structure spanning an actual river. He is going to Paris to engage with the intellectual world that has been developing, in French, the same arguments he has been making in English. He is going, in the way that Thomas Paine always goes, without a fully formed plan, with enormous confidence in his own capacity to find what he needs when he arrives, with the accumulated intellectual and moral resources of a life that has prepared him, through difficulty and failure and improbable triumph, for whatever comes next. He arrives in England in the spring of 1787, and England, which released him in 1774 with the indifference of a country that did not know what it was losing, receives him now with something considerably more interesting: curiosity. He is not famous in England in the way that he is famous in America. Common sense was not widely circulated in Britain, and the crisis papers were known primarily to those who followed American affairs closely, but he is known, in the circles that matter to him, as a man of remarkable intellectual force whose work in America has attracted the attention of people whose attention is worth having. He goes to Yorkshire, to the iron works at Rotherham operated by the Walker family, a firm of ironmasters who have the technical capability to assess his bridge design and the commercial capacity to invest in it if the assessment is favorable. He presents his model. The Walkers examine it with the professional thoroughness of men who know their trade, and their verdict is encouraging. The design is sound, the engineering principles are correct, the single-arch construction is feasible in iron on the scale Thomas is proposing. They agree to build a full-scale trial section of the bridge for exhibition and assessment. Thomas is delighted. He is also distracted, in the particular way that a man of his intellectual range is always distracted when the world is providing him with interesting things to think about. Because England in 1787 is providing him with a great deal that is interesting, and not merely technically interesting, but politically and morally interesting in ways that are beginning to reawaken the most essential part of his nature. He sees poverty. He sees it with the fresh eyes of a man who has been away for 13 years and who has spent those 13 years in a society that, for all its imperfections, has a different relationship with the idea of human possibility than the one he grew up in. The England he left in 1774 was a country of deep and apparently immovable social hierarchy, of agricultural laborers whose wages had not meaningfully risen in a generation, of urban poor crowded into the rookeries and courts of London and the industrial towns of the Midlands in conditions that no rational examination of human dignity can justify. The England he returns to in 1787 is the same country. The hierarchy is unchanged. The poverty is unchanged. The political arrangements that produce and maintain both are unchanged. He sees it. He thinks about it. He connects it, with the same systematic logical intelligence that has always connected observations to principles and principles to arguments, to everything he has been thinking about the relationship between political freedom and economic condition. He is not yet ready to write what these observations are building toward. But he is storing them, in the precise and retentive memory of a man who has spent his life noticing what others prefer not to see. He visits France. He crosses the Channel and arrives in Paris in the late summer of 1787, and Paris, with Jefferson at the American legation and the salons of the progressive aristocracy open to a man of his reputation, receives him with a warmth and intellectual engagement that England has never quite mustered. He meets the great figures of the French Enlightenment, the scientists and philosophers and reformers who are, in these years just before the Revolution, conducting the most ambitious intellectual project of the age, the systematic application of reason to every aspect of human life and human organization, the patient, thorough, sometimes reckless dismantling of the inherited assumptions of centuries in favor of principles that can be demonstrated rather than merely asserted. He meets the Marquis de Condorcet, the mathematician and philosopher who is developing his ideas about social progress with a rigor and optimism that Thomas finds profoundly congenial. He meets other figures of the reforming circles, men and women who are watching the government of Louis XVI with increasing alarm, who can see in the financial crisis of the French state and the political intransigence of the aristocracy the outlines of a crisis whose resolution no one can yet clearly foresee. He also meets Edmund Burke. Burke is, in 1787, one of the most celebrated political thinkers in the English-speaking world, an Irish-born member of Parliament of formidable intelligence and rhetorical power, a man who was a vigorous defender of the American cause during the Revolution and who has been, for most of his political career, associated with the reforming wing of the Whig Party. Thomas and Burke know each other from Thomas's London visits of the early 1770s, and the friendship that develops between them in these years, a friendship between two men of very different temperaments and ultimately, it will emerge, very different fundamental convictions, is one of the most intellectually charged and personally significant relationships of Thomas's life. They walk together through the streets of London. They argue with the engaged, respectful energy of two men who have genuinely listened to each other for long enough to know where the real disagreements lie. They agree about America. They agree about the corruption of the British parliamentary system. They agree in general terms about the need for political reform in England. The disagreements, the deep, structural, ultimately irreconcilable disagreements about the nature of tradition and the authority of inherited institutions and the question of how much the present generation is bound by the choices of its predecessors, are present but not yet fully drawn out. They will be drawn out, with historical force and lasting consequence, when France explodes and both men respond to the explosion in ways that reveal, beyond any possibility of ambiguity, how different their fundamental visions of human society actually are. But that is still 2 years away. In 1787 and 1788, Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke are friends, arguing, stimulating, disagreeing in the productive, unresolved way that genuine intellectual friendship sometimes achieves before the moment arrives that forces every ambiguity to resolve. The bridge model is exhibited in London. It attracts attention, draws visitors, and is assessed favorably by a number of engineers and men of scientific standing. Thomas is hopeful. He is engaged on multiple fronts simultaneously: the bridge, the Paris connections, the English political scene, the transatlantic correspondence with Washington and Jefferson and Madison that keeps him connected to the American Republic, whose progress he follows with the proprietary interest of a man who helped to build it. He is 50 years old, in good health, intellectually at the peak of his formidable powers, moving between London and Paris with the easy cosmopolitanism of a man who has spent his life crossing borders and finding, on the other side of them, not the alien incomprehensibility that borders are supposed to contain, but simply more people asking the same fundamental questions about justice and freedom and the proper organization of human life that he has been asking since the Headstrong Club at the White Hart Inn in Lewes. He does not know, he cannot know, that the world is about to provide him with his greatest subject. That the questions he has been asking in American coffee houses and English debating societies and French salons are about to be answered, in France, in the most dramatic and violent and consequential way that the 18th century will produce. That the friendship with Edmund Burke is about to become one of the great intellectual antagonisms of the age, producing on both sides writing that will define the terms of political debate for generations. He does not know any of this. He knows the bridge is progressing. He knows the conversation with Paris is rich and stimulating. He knows that the old questions, the questions about kings and people, about power and its proper limits, about what a human being is owed simply by virtue of being human, are not settled, not even in America, and nowhere near settled in France, and not even being properly asked in England. He is ready to ask them again. He is always ready to ask them again. 50 years old, and still, beneath everything, the corset-maker's son from Thetford, still restless, still precise, still constitutionally incapable of looking at an injustice and declining to name it, still reaching for the plain word that cuts through, still believing, with the stubborn, unquenchable faith of a man who has staked his entire life on the proposition, that reason, honestly applied, can make the world better than it is. The storm is coming. He does not yet see its full shape. But when it arrives he will be there, pen in hand, at the center of it. He always is. Chapter 9. Rights of Man and the French Revolution, 1787 to 1792. Paris in the summer of 1789 is a city that has lost its equilibrium. There is a feeling in the streets, felt in the body before it is understood by the mind, the way that certain atmospheric pressures are felt before the storm that produces them is visible, of something enormous shifting beneath the surface of ordinary life, of the familiar structures of a very old society straining against forces that those structures were not designed to contain. The bread is expensive in the specific, catastrophic way that bread becomes expensive when harvests fail and a government is too bankrupt to intervene, and the people who are hungry are also the people who have no political mechanism through which to express their hunger except the street. The court at Versailles continues its elaborate ceremonial life at a distance of 12 miles from the city, and that distance, physical, social, moral, almost cosmological in its implications, has never felt wider or more dangerous. Thomas Paine is in the middle of all of it. He has been moving between London and Paris for 2 years now, following the bridge project, sustaining the philosophical friendships, watching with the particular attention of a man who has already seen one revolution and knows, from the inside, what the preliminary symptoms look like. What he is watching in France in 1787 and 1788 has those symptoms in abundance: the financial crisis of the state, the intransigence of the privileged orders, the spreading, accelerating anger of people who have run out of patience with an arrangement that serves everyone except them. He watches it with the fascination and the moral engagement of someone who believes, without reservation, that what is happening is not merely a French crisis but a human one. A moment in the long, difficult, still unresolved argument between the principle of inherited power and the principle of natural right that has defined the political history of the modern world. The crisis breaks in the summer of 1789. It breaks not in a single moment but in a cascade of moments, each one overtaking the last before it can be fully absorbed. The convening of the Estates General in May, the formation of the National Assembly in June, the tennis court oath in which the Third Estate's delegates swear not to disperse until France has a constitution, the dismissal of the popular finance minister Necker in early July, and then, on the 14th of that month, the storming of the Bastille. The old fortress prison on the eastern edge of Paris falls to a crowd of several hundred Parisians in an afternoon, its governor is killed, its handful of prisoners are freed, and the ancient symbol of royal arbitrary power is reduced to rubble that the people of Paris will spend months systematically dismantling, selling the stones as souvenirs of a tyranny they intend never to permit again. Thomas receives the news of the Bastille with a response that is, for him, entirely characteristic. He is electrified. He is in England when it happens, and he follows the reports arriving from Paris with the intensity of a man watching something he has been waiting for. Not this specific event, not this specific form, but the underlying thing, the assertion of popular sovereignty against hereditary power, the demand for rights rather than the petition for mercy, for a very long time. He writes to correspondents in France. He writes to Thomas Jefferson, who is still in Paris as American minister and who witnesses these events with the ambivalent excitement of a Virginia planter deeply committed to the principles of liberty and deeply uncertain about the implications of their most radical application. He paces probably. He argues with everyone he can find who is willing to engage with the scale of what France is in the process of doing. He also watches Edmund Burke. Burke has been following the French developments with an attention that is, in its way, as intense as Thomas's own, but producing, as it builds, a response of radically different character. Where Thomas sees in the Revolution the vindication of the principles he has been arguing for 20 years, Burke sees something that frightens him at a level deeper than political disagreement. He sees the destruction of the inherited structures, the church, the aristocracy, the ancient legal traditions, the accumulated wisdom of centuries encoded in custom and institution, that, in his understanding of human society, are not obstacles to human flourishing but the very conditions of its possibility. He sees a mob tearing down what took generations to build, in the name of abstract principles that cannot, in Burke's deeply skeptical view, substitute for the lived, particular, historically grounded arrangements through which actual human communities actually function. In November of 1790, Burke publishes Reflections on the Revolution in France. It is one of the most powerful pieces of political writing in the English language, eloquent, passionate, learned, deeply argued, and, in Thomas Paine's view when he reads it, fundamentally, urgently, dangerously wrong. Thomas reads it quickly. He reads it with the focused attention of a man encountering an argument serious enough to require a serious answer. And the annotation happening in his mind as he reads is essentially the first draft of what will become Rights of Man. He is not merely disagreeing with Burke on specific points. He is recognizing, in the Reflections, the articulation of a worldview that is the precise and systematic opposite of everything he has believed and argued and built his life around. Burke is defending the authority of tradition and the wisdom of inherited institutions against the claims of reason and natural right. Thomas has spent his entire adult life arguing exactly the opposite position, that tradition is not wisdom but habit, that inherited institutions are not the repository of accumulated human experience but the instruments by which the powerful maintain their power against the legitimate claims of everyone else, and that reason, honestly applied, is not the enemy of good government but its only reliable foundation. He begins to write immediately. He writes with the urgency of a man who understands that Burke's Reflections is already circulating widely, already shaping the English response to the French Revolution, already providing the intellectual framework within which the governing class of Britain will understand and resist the implications of what is happening across the Channel. The argument must be answered, and answered now, and answered in the plain, direct, comprehensive language that Burke's elegant eloquence has deliberately made it easy to forget is available. Part 1 of Rights of Man is published in February of 1791, dedicated to George Washington, a dedication that is both a statement of allegiance and a strategic choice, invoking the most universally respected name in the Atlantic world as the embodiment of the principles Thomas is defending. The dedication serves notice that what follows is not the work of a dangerous radical with no connection to the respectable world of legitimate governance, but the work of a man who helped found the first successful republic in the modern age and who speaks from the authority of that experience. The argument begins with Burke. Thomas goes through the Reflections with surgical precision, extracting Burke's central claims and subjecting them, one by one, to the plain logical analysis that is his most devastating instrument. He identifies what he considers Burke's foundational error, the claim that one generation can bind its successors, that the settlement of 1688, in which the English Parliament established the terms of constitutional monarchy after the Glorious Revolution, can legitimately bind every subsequent English generation in perpetuity, foreclosing the possibility of further constitutional change by the sovereign act of the living people. Thomas demolishes this claim with an argument that is, in its simplicity, almost shocking. The dead, he points out, cannot govern the living. Every generation is sovereign in its own right, sovereign not because any previous generation granted it sovereignty but because sovereignty is not a gift that one generation can give or withhold from another. It is the natural condition of any living community of people, the inherent and inalienable right of people who are alive and present to determine the terms of their own governance. Burke's Parliament of 1688 had every right to determine the governance of its own era. It had no right whatsoever to determine the governance of an era it would never live in, of people who were not yet born and could not have consented to the arrangement. The claim to have bound all future generations is not the exercise of constitutional wisdom. It is the exercise of a power that no generation legitimately possesses. He then moves to the positive argument, the argument not against Burke but for the principles that Burke is opposing. He begins, as he always begins, from first principles, from the most fundamental questions about the nature of human beings and their rights and their proper relationship to the governments they create. All men, he argues, and here he is drawing on the natural rights tradition of Locke and expanding it with a directness and a universality that Locke himself was careful to hedge, are born equal in natural rights. Not similar rights. Not comparable rights. Equal rights. The same rights, every one of them, regardless of the family they are born into, the country they inhabit, the religion they practice, the property they possess. Government does not create these rights. Government cannot create them because they pre-exist government, existing in the nature of human beings before any political arrangement is made. What government can do, what it exists to do, is protect them. And when government fails to protect them or actively violates them, or is organized in such a way that their violation is systematic and permanent, the people from whom all legitimate governmental authority derives have not merely the right but the obligation to change it. He addresses hereditary monarchy and hereditary aristocracy with a bluntness that makes his earlier treatment of monarchy in Common Sense seem almost gentle by comparison. He has had 15 more years of observation and thinking since Common Sense, and what those years have taught him has only deepened his conviction that the hereditary principle is not merely politically unjust but philosophically incoherent, that the idea of governing capacity transmitted through bloodline is not a constitutional tradition but a superstition, as rational as expecting wisdom to descend through families because the grandfather was wise, as just as condemning a child to poverty, because the grandfather was poor. The aristocracy of France, the ornate, ancient, privilege-encrusted aristocracy that is, at this very moment, being dismantled in the streets of Paris. He treats not as a venerable institution being unjustly destroyed but as a human construction, like any other, whose claim to perpetuity is no stronger than the claim of any other arrangement that serves the few at the expense of the many. He is careful to distinguish between the individuals who happen to have been born into aristocratic families, who are no more responsible for that accident than anyone is responsible for the circumstances of their birth, and the institution itself, which is the thing he is arguing against. The person is not the problem. The system is the problem. And the system can be changed. Rights of Man, Part 1, sells in extraordinary numbers, into the hundreds of thousands by the estimates of the period, distributed across Britain and Ireland and America and translated into French and German and Dutch. It provokes responses from every direction, enthusiastic embrace from the reformers and radicals of the English political opposition, alarmed condemnation from the establishment press and the government circles that are watching the French developments with increasing anxiety and finding in Burke's reflections the intellectual justification for a conservative reaction that is beginning to organize itself. Thomas watches the political situation in France continue to develop. He visits Paris regularly, maintains his friendships with the revolutionary leadership, with Condorcet, with Lafayette, with the Girondins who represent the more moderate, constitutionalist wing of the revolutionary movement. He is a figure of considerable celebrity in French revolutionary circles, his American experience giving him a prestige that no purely French revolutionary can quite match. He is, after all, a man who has already helped to make a revolution, who has seen from the inside how the gap between revolutionary principle and revolutionary practice is navigated, what it costs, what it requires, what it is possible to get right and what almost always goes wrong. He is also being watched by the British government. William Pitt's administration, alarmed by the combination of French revolutionary energy and the growing English radical movement, the corresponding societies, the reform clubs, the working-class political organizations that are reading Rights of Man in their thousands and drawing conclusions about English governance that the establishment finds alarming, is moving toward repression. The suppression of seditious publications, the prosecution of radical writers, the systematic harassment of reform organizations are all becoming features of the English political landscape with a speed that tells Thomas, clearly and unmistakably, which way the wind is blowing. He writes Part 2 of Rights of Man. It is published in February of 1792, and it is a more ambitious document than Part 1. Less directly engaged with Burke, more positively and programmatically concerned with what a just government would actually look like in practice. It is, in some ways, the most startlingly modern of all Thomas Paine's works, the one that most clearly anticipates the political debates of the following 2 centuries rather than simply resolving those of the 18th. He proposes progressive taxation, higher rates on larger incomes and larger inheritances, not merely to raise revenue but to prevent the accumulation of wealth in forms that reproduce hereditary inequality across generations. He proposes public funding for universal education. Every child in England, regardless of family wealth, entitled to schooling at public expense, because a republic of informed citizens requires citizens who can actually read and reason. He proposes what we would recognize as an early version of Social Security, public payments to the elderly poor, to families with young children, to those unable to work through illness or disability, funded through the revenues of progressive taxation and administered not through the demeaning apparatus of parish charity but as a right, claimed without humiliation, owed by the community to its members as a matter of justice rather than benevolence. These proposals are, in 1792, extraordinary. They anticipate by more than a century the welfare state that European democracies will gradually construct through the 19th and 20th centuries. They represent Thomas Paine's fullest articulation of the idea, present in his thinking since the poverty of the excise beats and the injustice of the corset-maker's wage, that political rights without economic security are incomplete, that a man who is starving cannot exercise his rights as a citizen in any meaningful sense, that the freedom promised by the revolution must be a freedom that reaches into the daily material life of ordinary people, or it is not freedom but a philosophical abstraction that leaves the actual conditions of actual lives unchanged. The British government responds to Part 2 with the decision to prosecute Thomas Paine for seditious libel. The charge is filed in May of 1792. It is, at one level, a legal proceeding, the formal machinery of government responding to a publication it finds threatening, and at another level a statement of intent. The Pitt administration is signaling to the radical movement that the era of tolerance for fundamental challenges to the existing order is over, that the boundary between permissible political argument and criminal sedition is being redrawn, and that Thomas Paine is on the wrong side of it. Thomas is in England when the prosecution is announced. He is in London, continuing his work, maintaining his correspondence, following the developments in France that are moving in the summer of 1792, with an accelerating speed and an increasing violence that is beginning to trouble even those who were most ardently supportive of the revolution's early constitutional phase. The overthrow of the monarchy in August of 1792, when a crowd storms the Tuileries Palace, the Swiss Guard is massacred, and Louis XVI is arrested and imprisoned, signals that the revolution has entered a new and more dangerous phase, one in which the moderate constitutional settlement that the Girondins and Lafayette and others had been working toward is being overtaken by forces more radical and more violent than the first revolutionaries anticipated. Thomas has been elected, in absentia, to the French National Convention, an honor extended to several foreign friends of the revolution, a recognition of his status as the man who helped argue the first modern republic into existence. He holds a French citizenship, granted by the revolutionary government as a gesture of solidarity with the principles he represents. The invitation to take his seat in the convention is both an honor and, in the circumstances of September 1792, a form of protection, because in France as a member of the convention he is a figure of official standing, while in England, he is about to be a defendant in a seditious libel prosecution. He makes his decision. He will go to France. He leaves England in September of 1792, departing from Dover with what later accounts describe as very little time to spare. The government's agents, it is said, close behind him, arriving at the dock only after the packet boat has already pushed away from the pier and is heading across the channel. Whether this dramatic detail is precisely accurate or somewhat embellished in the retelling is impossible to say with certainty. What is certain is that Thomas Paine crosses the Channel to France in September of 1792 and does not return to England for the rest of his life. He is tried in absentia in December of 1792. He is found guilty of seditious libel. He is declared an outlaw in England. The country of his birth has formally, legally, finally rejected him, not as an incompetent corset-maker or a failed excise officer or a bankrupt shopkeeper, but as a thinker, as a writer, as a man whose ideas are considered by the government of the day to be too dangerous to be permitted in the land that produced them. It is, in its perverse way, the most complete vindication of his life's work that England could have offered him. He has written things powerful enough to be declared criminal. He has argued things consequential enough to make a government afraid. The corset-maker's son from Thetford has become, in the eyes of the most powerful government in the world, a genuine threat to the established order. He crosses to France. The crowds at Calais receive him as a hero, as the author of Common Sense and Rights of Man, as the friend of the American and French revolutions, as a man who embodies in his own extraordinary biography the principles that the revolution is attempting, at enormous cost and with mounting violence, to realize in the world. He does not know, cannot yet know, what the revolution is about to do to its friends. The storm that is coming in France is not the clean, rational, principled storm that Thomas Paine has been arguing for across 2 decades. It is something darker and more complicated and more terrible. And he is about to be inside it, without the pamphlet and without the pen and without the plain words that have always, until now, been equal to whatever the moment required. The page for once will not be enough. Chapter 10. Prison, the Age of Reason, and a Controversial End, 1793 to 1809. Paris in the winter of 1793 is a city that has turned on itself. The revolution, that great and luminous argument for the natural rights of human beings, has entered a phase in which the rights of human beings are being violated on a scale and with a systematic thoroughness that the old regime, for all its cruelties, rarely matched. The guillotine stands in the place de la Révolution and works with the methodical efficiency of an institution that has persuaded itself that murder, when performed in the name of the people, is not murder but justice. The Committee of Public Safety, that chilling euphemism for an apparatus of political terror, has assumed effective control of the French government, and Maximilien Robespierre, small and precise and utterly convinced of his own righteousness, presides over a purge that is consuming, with indiscriminate ferocity, the very men and women who made the revolution possible. Thomas Paine watches this with horror. He is in Paris, a member of the National Convention, sitting with the Girondins, the moderate constitutionalist faction that has been arguing, with diminishing success and increasing danger, for a revolution that stays true to its own stated principles. He is 56 years old, in indifferent health, living in lodgings on the Faubourg Saint-Denis with a small community of English and American expatriates who are watching the developments around them with the particular anxiety of foreigners in a country that is beginning to treat foreignness as a form of political suspicion. He is still writing. He is always writing, but the writing is now directed at specific, urgent, potentially life-or-death questions. When Louis XVI is brought before the convention for trial in December of 1792, Thomas argues, in a speech delivered through an interpreter, against execution. He argues not for the king's innocence. He is quite clear that Louis has failed his people in ways that justify removal from power, but against the death penalty on principled grounds, and with the practical argument that executing the king will alienate the American Republic, still grateful to France for its support during the Revolution, and hand a propaganda victory to Britain. The convention votes for execution. Louis XVI goes to the guillotine on the 21st of January, 1793. Thomas watches the momentum of the terror building around him and understands, with the clarity of a man who has seen enough of political processes to know when one is running beyond the control of its own stated principles, that he is in a dangerous place. The Girondins are being systematically destroyed. Robespierre and the Jacobins are consolidating power with the ruthless efficiency of people who have convinced themselves that the elimination of their opponents is not a political choice but a moral obligation. The logic of the terror is circular and self-reinforcing and impervious to the kind of plain-spoken rational argument that Thomas has always relied on to change minds. It does not engage with counter-arguments because it has defined counter-argument itself as evidence of counter-revolutionary intent. In June of 1793, the Girondins are expelled from the convention and arrested. Thomas, as a foreigner and an associate of the Girondin faction, is now in an exposed position of considerable danger. A decree is passed in the autumn of 1793 ordering the arrest of all foreigners born in countries at war with France, which includes Britain, and which therefore includes Thomas Paine, whose French citizenship is insufficient protection against a government that is reinterpreting its own rules with the creative flexibility of a regime operating outside the law it claims to be enforcing. On the night of the 28th of December, 1793, agents of the Committee of General Security come to Thomas's lodgings and arrest him. He is taken to the Luxembourg prison, which has been converted from a royal palace into a place of detention for the revolution's political prisoners. A building of some grandeur housing a population of profound misery, men and women who have been arrested on charges that range from the vaguely defined to the transparently invented, who are waiting with the terrible patience of people who do not know whether they are waiting for release or for the blade. Thomas knows what the Luxembourg means. He knows that the path from the Luxembourg to the guillotine has been well traveled in recent months. He is a man who has written with great clarity about the injustice of arbitrary imprisonment, about the right of every human being to due process and fair treatment, and he is now experiencing that injustice from the inside, arrested without specific charge, held without trial, subject to the absolute discretion of men whose discretion is being exercised in an atmosphere of paranoia and political calculation that has nothing to do with justice of any recognizable kind. He is sick. The Luxembourg is cold and damp, and Thomas, whose health has never fully recovered from the Atlantic fever of 1774, who has lived hard and worked hard across more than 5 decades, deteriorates physically under the conditions of imprisonment with a speed that reflects how much his constitution has been worn down by the accumulated exertions of his extraordinary life. He develops an abscess on his side, a serious infection in the era before antibiotics, potentially, in the wrong circumstances, fatal. He is attended by other prisoners who have medical knowledge, cared for as well as the conditions allow, but the illness is serious and prolonged and adds to the already considerable uncertainty about whether Thomas Paine will survive the Luxembourg. He writes, "Even here, even in prison, even sick and cold and facing the real possibility of the guillotine," he writes. He is working on a manuscript that he has been developing for several years, a systematic examination of religion, of the Bible, of the institution of organized Christianity, of the relationship between what human beings can know through reason and observation and what they are asked to believe on the authority of texts and traditions and ecclesiastical institutions. It is called the Age of Reason, and it is, in some ways, the most personally revealing of all his works, the most direct expression of what Thomas Paine actually believes at the deepest level, about the nature of the universe and humanity's place within it. He is not an atheist. This is a fact that is frequently misunderstood, both by those who celebrate him and by those who condemn him, and it matters enough to be stated clearly. Thomas Paine believes in God, in a creator, in a divine intelligence that is evident in the extraordinary order and beauty and complexity of the natural world, in the rationality of the universe that science is systematically uncovering. He believes in this God with something very like religious feeling, with awe and gratitude and a sense of the sublime that the natural world consistently produces in him. What he does not believe in, What he argues against in the Age of Reason with the full force of his considerable analytical intelligence, is revealed religion, the claim that God has communicated specific instructions and doctrines to specific human beings, which have then been recorded in specific texts, which are then interpreted by specific institutions, which then demand on the basis of this chain of human mediation the unquestioning obedience of everyone else. He examines the Bible. He reads it. He has always read it carefully with the same precise, retentive attention he brings to any important document, and he applies to it the same analytical standards he applies to any claim about the world. Is this consistent? Is this coherent? Is this supported by the evidence? Is this what an honest examination of the text actually shows? Or is this what people have been told the text shows by authorities with an institutional interest in a particular interpretation? His conclusions are, by the standards of his era, explosive. He finds the Old Testament full of violence and moral incoherence. A text in which a supposedly perfect deity commands actions that no rational moral framework can justify, in which women are treated as property and genocide is presented as divine instruction. He finds the New Testament more admirable in its moral teaching. He has genuine respect for the ethical principles attributed to Jesus, the love of neighbor, the concern for the poor, the resistance to Pharisaic legalism, but argues that the institutional Christianity built on the foundation of Jesus's teaching has systematically betrayed those teachings in favor of institutional power, hierarchy, and the enforcement of orthodoxy through exactly the kinds of arbitrary authority that Jesus himself consistently opposed. He argues for what he calls deism, the belief in a creator God known through reason and the evidence of the natural world rather than through revealed texts or ecclesiastical tradition. This is not an unusual position in the Enlightenment intellectual world. It is the position of many of the most distinguished thinkers of the age, including Jefferson and Franklin. But Thomas states it with a directness and a comprehensiveness and a willingness to name specific biblical passages and specific institutional practices that goes considerably further than the cautious, private deism of most of his contemporaries, who hold similar views but express them in private correspondence rather than published pamphlets aimed at the widest possible readership. He writes Part 1 of The Age of Reason in prison, under the shadow of the guillotine, completing the manuscript and passing it to Joel Barlow, an American diplomat and friend who visits the Luxembourg, for safekeeping and eventual publication. It is published in 1794, while Thomas is still imprisoned, and the response in America and Britain is swift and ferocious. Religious establishments on both sides of the Atlantic condemn it with a vehemence that exceeds anything directed at common sense or rights of man. He is called an atheist, a blasphemer, an enemy of civilization. The men who have been his allies and admirers, the good Christians of the American founding generation, many of whom privately hold views not entirely unlike his own, find it politically and personally impossible to defend him. The religious fury directed at the Age of Reason will shadow Thomas Paine's reputation for the rest of his life and long after it. He comes very close to the guillotine. Closer than he knows until later. The story that has passed into the biographical record, which Thomas himself recounts and which there is no strong reason to disbelieve, is this. In the summer of 1794, at the height of the terror, prisoners in the Luxembourg are being taken in groups for trial and execution. The door of a cell is marked with chalk by the agents who pass through, the mark designating which prisoners are to be taken the following morning. On the night in question, the door of Thomas's cell is standing open against the wall when the agent passes through, and the chalk mark is made on the inside of the door rather than the outside. When the door is closed for the night, the mark faces the wall. The prisoners who are taken the next morning are those from cells whose marks are visible. Thomas Paine's mark is not visible. He lives because a door is open. Robespierre falls on the 9th of Thermidor, the 27th of July, 1794. By the calendar, the revolution has replaced the old one within its systematic attempt to begin the world entirely anew. He is arrested, tried in the accelerated manner of the terror, and guillotined within 2 days. The fall of Robespierre does not immediately end the imprisonments. The machinery of the terror does not stop the moment its architect is removed, and Thomas remains in the Luxembourg through the summer. But the political atmosphere is changing, the appetite for mass execution is diminishing, and the men who have been held for political reasons begin to be released. James Monroe, the newly appointed American minister to France, intervenes on Thomas's behalf with a persistence and a personal warmth that Thomas never forgets. Monroe argues to the French authorities that Thomas is an American citizen, a claim that is legally complicated given Thomas's British birth and French electoral office, but that Monroe makes with a diplomat's confident disregard for inconvenient technicalities. The argument succeeds. Thomas is released from the Luxembourg on the 4th of November, 1794, after 10 months of imprisonment. He is in very poor health. The abscess has been serious. The months of cold and inadequate food and the constant proximity of death have aged him in ways that are visible in his face and in the quality of his physical movement. Monroe takes him in. Thomas lives in the Monroe household for more than a year, recovering his health slowly, eating regular meals, sleeping in a warm bed, being tended with the considerate hospitality of a family that understands what he has endured and what he represents. He is grateful with the deep, specific gratitude of a man who knows that the kindness he is receiving is not merely comfort but survival, that without Monroe's intervention and without Monroe's household, the physical deterioration begun in the Luxembourg might well have continued to a conclusion. He writes Part 2 of The Age of Reason during his recovery at Monroe's house. It is more detailed than Part 1, more specifically engaged with the text of the Bible, more systematically critical of organized Christianity. Its publication deepens the religious controversy that Part 1 began and ensures that the reconciliation with the American establishment that might otherwise have been possible after his imprisonment is not going to happen. The men who might have welcomed him back, who admired common sense and respected his service to the Revolution, find the Age of Reason an insurmountable obstacle. They cannot be seen to embrace a man who has written what he has written about the Christian faith, in a country where religious sentiment is both genuine and politically potent. He remains in France for several more years, living in Paris, writing, remaining engaged with the political life of the Republic that the Terror has left behind it. He writes Agrarian Justice in 1797, a pamphlet that is, in some respects, his most economically radical work, arguing that the earth in its natural state is the common inheritance of all humanity, and that those who have enclosed and privatized land owe compensation to those who have been dispossessed of their natural share. He proposes a specific mechanism, a ground rent paid by landowners into a national fund, from which every person reaching adulthood would receive a capital grant and every person reaching old age would receive a pension. It is, in its essential structure, a proposal for what the 20th century will call the welfare state, arrived at not from socialist theory but from the natural rights philosophy that has been Thomas's intellectual foundation since Thetford. The France of the late 1790s is not the France of the Revolution's idealistic opening. It is a country exhausted by a decade of war and political upheaval, moving under the pressure of military necessity and political exhaustion toward the strong executive authority that will eventually install Napoleon Bonaparte as first consul in 1799 and emperor in 1804. Thomas watches this development with the dismay of a man who has spent his life arguing against concentrated executive power and who now sees the revolution he helped to inspire producing, in its conclusion, a military dictatorship more absolute than the monarchy it replaced. He writes to Napoleon once, with the directness of a man who has written to kings and presidents and congressional committees with the same plain-spoken assessment of what they are doing wrong. Napoleon does not reply with any enthusiasm. The relationship between Thomas Paine and Napoleon Bonaparte is essentially the relationship between a principle and its violation, and both men understand this, though only one of them would put it in those terms. He wants to go home. He has been wanting to go home, to America, which is home now, the only home he has, for years, but the practical obstacles have been considerable. Britain controls the seas, and any ship crossing the Atlantic risks British interdiction, and Thomas Paine is still an outlaw in Britain, still under the conviction of seditious libel, still the man whose extradition any British naval captain would consider a prize worth pursuing. He waits. He petitions. He writes to Jefferson, who has become President of the United States in 1801, asking for assistance in arranging passage. Jefferson responds with warmth and with the offer of a place on an American naval vessel that is crossing to the United States, an offer that is both a personal gesture of friendship and a political statement, a sitting president of the United States publicly extending protection and transportation to a man whom a significant portion of the American public considers a dangerous blasphemer. Jefferson makes the offer knowing exactly what it will cost him politically, and he makes it anyway, because he is a man who knows what he owes Thomas Paine and is not entirely willing to pretend otherwise. Thomas arrives in Baltimore in October of 1802. He is 65 years old. He has been away from America for 15 years. The reception is not what he might have hoped for. The America he returns to is a country that has moved, in 15 years, in directions that complicate his relationship with it. The religious controversy of the Age of Reason has poisoned a significant portion of public opinion against him. The Federalist press, the newspapers aligned with the political establishment that Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans have just defeated in the election of 1800, greets his return with a campaign of denunciation that is personal, vicious, and relentless. He is called an atheist, a drunkard, a traitor, a man of no morals and no principles, a foreign troublemaker who should never have been permitted to return. The campaign has very little relationship to the actual Thomas Paine, to the man who donated his earnings to the Continental Army and organized private financing for its relief, but it has a great deal of relationship to the political usefulness of destroying the reputation of a man who remains, simply by existing and by being welcomed by Jefferson, an inconvenient symbol of radical democratic principles. He settles for periods in New York and in New Rochelle, where the farm granted to him by the state of New York is still his, though its management during his long absence has left it in somewhat dilapidated condition. He writes. He continues to write political essays, scientific observations, theological arguments, with a persistence that is admirable and a declining physical vitality that is evident in the writing itself, which retains its clarity and its directness but has lost something of the propulsive energy that once made even his most technical arguments feel urgent and alive. His health is failing steadily. The accumulated physical cost of his extraordinary life, the Atlantic crossing, the fever of 1774, the decade of wartime service, the imprisonment in the Luxembourg, the years of inadequate nutrition and insufficient rest that are the material condition of a man who has never made comfort a priority, is presenting itself in the form of a body that is wearing out. He has strokes. He has periods of serious illness. He drinks more than is good for him, which gives his enemies material for the accusations of drunkenness that they circulate with enthusiasm, and he is too proud and too sick to effectively refute. He is also in these last years largely alone. The friends of his great years, Franklin is long dead, Washington is dead, Greene is dead, are gone. Jefferson, still living, maintains a private correspondence with Thomas but finds it politically impossible to be seen publicly supporting a man so thoroughly stigmatized by the religious and political establishments. The ordinary social world of the American Republic has little room for a man of his reputation and his views. He is too radical for the respectable, too irreligious for the devout, too associated with the excesses of the French Revolution for the cautious, and too old and sick to generate the new writing that might re-establish his relevance. There is a moment, in the last years, that captures something essential about the distance between what Thomas Paine is and how his country has come to treat him. In 1806, he applies to vote in the New Rochelle elections and is turned away by the election supervisor on the grounds that he is not an American citizen, the argument being that his service as a French citizen, and his acceptance of French electoral office, have compromised his American nationality. It is a legal argument of questionable validity and transparent political motivation, and it is directed at the man who wrote Common Sense, who argued independence into existence when the members of the Continental Congress were still hesitating, who gave his earnings to Washington's army and his health to the American cause. He appeals. He is denied. He accepts the denial with a dignity that the denial does not deserve. He moves to New York City in 1808, to a house on Herring Street in Greenwich Village, cared for by a French couple named Bonneville, Marguerite Bonneville, the wife of a French publisher who had been a friend and supporter, tends to Thomas in these last months with a devotion that represents the human warmth that his public life, so thoroughly stripped of personal comfort by his own choices and the cruelty of his opponents, has rarely provided. He dies on the 8th of June, 1809. He is 72 years old. He dies in the early morning in the house on Herring Street, attended by Marguerite Bonneville and by the ordinary quiet of a summer morning in a city that does not yet know it has lost him. He dies as he lived, without significant property, without institutional affiliation, without the formal recognition of the country he helped to found. He is asked to be buried in a Quaker cemetery, a final reaching back toward the faith of his father, the quiet man who came to the docks at Thetford and brought his son home from the privateer's boat, whose influence runs through Thomas's life like an underground river, shaping the surface from below without ever fully revealing itself. The Quaker's refuse. He is buried instead on the farm at New Rochelle, on a small rise overlooking the land that New York gave him and that he never quite knew how to inhabit. The funeral is small. A handful of people. Marguerite Bonneville and her son. A few local residents. No senators, no congressmen, no representatives of the republic whose founding he made possible. The man who wrote that these are the times that try men's souls is lowered into the ground on a June morning with almost no one watching. 10 years later, the English radical journalist William Cobbett, who has had his own complicated relationship with Thomas Paine's legacy, having once denounced him and having come to a profound reversal of that judgment, digs up the bones. He intends to return them to England, to bury them there with the honors that America has failed to provide, to build a monument that the country whose governing class Thomas's writing most deeply threatened has also, it turns out, no interest in constructing. The bones travel to England. The monument is never built. The bones are eventually lost, scattered, dispersed, their final resting place unknown, and the man who argued for the rights of every human being to dignity and recognition ends without a grave that anyone can visit. And yet, the absence of a grave has not diminished Thomas Paine. The attempts to erase him, the religious condemnations, the political denunciations, the systematic effort of the comfortable and the powerful to ensure that the most consequential democratic thinker of the 18th century is remembered, if at all, as a drunkard and a blasphemer, have not succeeded. They have never succeeded. They cannot succeed because the words are still there. The words are always still there. These are the times that try men's souls. All men are created equal. The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. These words did not need a monument or a grave or the approval of the establishment or the gratitude of the Republic. They needed only to be written in plain language for the people who needed them most at the moments when they were most needed. And they were written. And they have not stopped working. The corset-maker's son from Thetford, who had nothing, who was given nothing, who was dismissed and bankrupt and widowed and imprisoned and outcast and denied the right to vote in the country he helped to found, that man picked up a pen in the darkest moments of the darkest centuries and wrote toward the light with everything he had. He had, it turns out, enough. History has not forgotten Thomas Paine. History never forgets the people who told it the truth.